Tonight, we will embark on a gentle journey, not to a destination, but into a deeper understanding of our own hearts. We will explore the timeless wisdom of the Bible, teachings that have served as a refuge for restless souls for thousands of years. These are not rules to follow or doctrines to memorize. They are invitations. Invitations to see your life differently, to soften your grip on what you think you can control, and to uncover the deep well of peace that has been within you all along. We will walk this path through a modern story of a life transformed and the simple, profound truths that guided it. Teachings that speak not to the busy, anxious mind, but to the quiet, knowing heart. We will learn to see our thoughts not as our masters, but as passing clouds, and our difficult emotions, our grief, our anger, our fear, not as enemies, but as messengers inviting us toward healing. Welcome to Sleepy Christian. This is your sanctuary, a space to rest your mind and nourish your spirit. There is nothing you need to do, nothing to fix, and no one you need to become. Simply allow these words to wash over you. If this path of quiet reflection calls to something deep within you, I invite you to subscribe and return to this space whenever you need to remember the peace that is available to you. For now, just breathe. Let us begin this journey together. The severance package arrived in a crisp, white envelope, its sterile appearance belying the chaos it delivered. For David, a man whose life had been built on the predictable columns of spreadsheets and the steady hum of office machinery, the termination letter felt less like a piece of paper and more like a demolition charge placed at the foundation of his identity. At 40 years old, he was an accountant without an account to manage, a provider suddenly stripped of his purpose. The drive home was a blur of gray asphalt and muted streetlights, the familiar route now feeling like a procession to a tomb. He parked in his driveway, the engine's silence echoing the hollow quiet that had taken root inside his chest. Inside, the house was a diorama of the life he feared he could no longer sustain. The faint scent of Sarah's lavender candle, the distant sound of his children's laughter from the living room, the worn comfort of the sofa, all of it seemed to accuse him. He stood in the foyer, the envelope crumpled in his sweaty palm, and felt the walls of his carefully constructed world buckle. His self-worth, so intricately tied to his job title and his ability to solve financial puzzles, proved to be a fragile thing, shattering upon impact with this single piece of corporate correspondence. Sarah found him there, still in his coat. Her approach was gentle, her face a canvas of immediate concern. She reached for him, her hand a soft, warm promise of solidarity, but he flinched away as if her touch were a brand. He could not bear the compassion in her eyes, seeing it not as love, but as pity. He offered a grunt, a dismissive wave of his hand, and retreated to the one place that still felt like his, the small, cluttered home office. He closed the door, the soft click of the latch sounding a final definitive note. Alone, the despair descended in full suffocating force. He sank into his leather chair, the very chair from which he had once orchestrated the financial security of his family, and stared at the blank computer screen. His reflection in the dark monitor was a ghost of the man he used to be, shoulders slumped, eyes vacant. The questions came then, unbidden and relentless. What was he without his career? What was the point of 2 decades of meticulous work, of missed bedtimes and sacrificed weekends, if it could all be erased with a single impersonal email? He was a column of numbers that no longer added up, an equation with no solution. The future, once a clear and predictable path, dissolved into a terrifying fog of uncertainty. He was not just unemployed, he was unmoored, adrift in a sea of his own irrelevance, questioning every choice, every sacrifice, and the very meaning of the life he had so painstakingly built. The dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light as David attacked the chaos of his desk with a grim determination born of desperation. For 3 days, he had wandered through the house like a ghost, the silence of unemployment pressing in on him until the very air felt thick and heavy. The clutter of his home office, once a testament to his busy professional life, now seemed a physical manifestation of his internal disarray. He began sorting through teetering stacks of old tax returns, obsolete software manuals, and forgotten client files, each discarded paper feeling like a small exorcism of his former self. It was buried beneath a decade's worth of financial journals, a weighty, forgotten object that stopped his frantic cleaning cold. His fingers brushed against the worn black leather cover, its gold-embossed cross faded to a soft, warm glimmer. He pulled it out, a cloud of ancient paper and memory filling the air, his grandmother's Bible. He could almost see her gnarled, gentle hands holding it, could almost hear the soft cadence of her voice reading from its pages on long-ago Sunday afternoons. A relic from a world of simple, unwavering faith he had long since dismissed as a childish fantasy. He sank back into his chair, the heavy book resting in his lap. A cynical part of him expected to feel nothing, to confirm his belief that these were just archaic words for a bygone era. He flipped it open at random, the thin onion-skin pages whispering secrets. His eyes fell not on a begat-laden genealogy or a fiery prophecy, but on a section titled The Beatitudes. He began to read, his accountant's mind automatically scanning for logical fallacies or impractical demands. Blessed are the poor in spirit. The words landed not as a judgment, but as a strange, unexpected acknowledgement. Poor in spirit. Was that not a perfect description of the hollowed-out man he had become? Blessed are those who mourn. He had been mourning, though he would never have called it that. He was mourning his career, his identity, his shattered sense of control. Blessed are the meek. A concept so foreign to his competitive climb-the-ladder worldview, it felt almost revolutionary. He read on, through the promises of comfort, inheritance, and satisfaction. A curious thing happened as his eyes moved down the page. The tight knot of anxiety that had been his constant companion for days began infinitesimally to loosen. The frantic, circling thoughts of failure and futility quieted, replaced by a profound and utterly alien sense of peace. It was not a booming voice or a sudden solution to his problems. It was a quiet warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling of being seen and understood in his brokenness, not in spite of it. This was not the God of wrath and rules he had vaguely imagined. This was a voice speaking directly to the weary, the grieving, the lost. For the first time since the envelope had arrived, the crushing weight on his shoulders felt just a little lighter, as if someone had placed a steadying hand upon them. His ingrained cynicism, the armor he had worn for so long, developed a hairline crack. Curiosity, a sensation he had not felt in weeks, began to stir, pushing through the crust of his despair. He did not close the book. Instead, he carefully smoothed the page, his thumb resting on the words, "For they will be comforted." He did not understand it. He could not explain it, but the feeling was real, a tiny, flickering flame in the overwhelming darkness of his circumstances. He reached for a pen, its movement deliberate, and drew a small, neat box around the passage in Matthew 5. It was not a declaration of faith, not yet. It was a marker, a single, tentative step onto a path he never knew existed. The journey, it seemed, had begun not with a shout, but with a whisper of inexplicable peace. The quiet peace David had found in the Beatitudes became a persistent, gentle tug, drawing him back to the worn leather Bible. The following morning, with a fresh cup of coffee steaming on the desk, he returned to the book of Matthew, his intention not just to read, but to understand. He picked up where he had left off, and the text unfurled before him, no longer a collection of comforting phrases, but a radical, demanding blueprint for living. This was the Sermon on the Mount, and it read less like gentle advice and more like a seismic shock to the foundations of his soul. The teachings on anger struck him first, a direct and uncomfortable spotlight on the simmering resentment he held for the executives who had let him go. The words declared that harboring such fury was akin to murder in the heart, a concept that felt both extreme and terrifyingly accurate. He thought of the cold, sharp words he had rehearsed in his mind, the fantasies of being vindicated. Then came the passage on lust, and he felt a flush of shame, remembering fleeting, secret glances he had justified as harmless. The text called it adultery of the heart, exposing the hypocrisy of his outward propriety. But the most difficult command, the one that seemed to defy all human instinct, was the call to love his enemies and pray for those who persecuted him. His enemy had a name, a former colleague, Paul, who had actively undermined him during the restructuring, securing his own position at David's expense. For hours, David wrestled with the words. They felt impossible, a standard no one could realistically meet. He argued with the text in his mind, listing all the reasons his anger was justified, his grudges earned. Yet the profound peace he had felt the day before lingered as a quiet witness, a stark contrast to the acidic churn of his bitterness. The teachings were not merely rules. They were presented as a path to a different kind of life, a life free from the prison of his own negative emotions. The burden of his anger and resentment was a weight he had carried for so long He had mistaken it for a part of himself. The scripture was offering him a way to set it down. The conviction settled deep within him, a clear and undeniable prompting. He could not just read these words, he had to try to live them. The first, most immediate application was Paul. An apology was required, not for anything specific he had said, but for the hatred he had nurtured in silence. The idea filled him with a cold dread. It felt like surrendering, like admitting defeat. But the alternative, continuing to carry the poison, felt even worse. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found Paul's number. Each ring felt like an eternity, a drumbeat counting down to his humiliation. When Paul answered, his voice was laced with the same casual arrogance David remembered. David took a breath and began, his voice quieter and less assured than he had hoped. He explained that he had been doing some thinking and that he wanted to apologize for any ill will between them, that he wished him well. The silence on the other end was heavy, suffocating. Then came the response, not anger, but a dismissive, almost pitying laugh. Paul told him he was being pathetic, that losing his job had clearly unhinged him, and that he should move on and stop dwelling on the past. The call ended with a sharp click. Rejection, cold and complete. For a moment, the old anger flared hot and defensive. He had been a fool. He had reached out in vulnerability only to be mocked. He sat there, the sting of humiliation fresh on his skin, expecting the familiar weight of bitterness to crash back down upon him. But it didn't. Instead, a remarkable thing happened. As the heat of his shame cooled, he realized the dense, heavy knot of resentment that had taken root in his chest was gone. It had simply vanished. In its place was a hollow space, a strange and unexpected lightness. He had obeyed the difficult command, and though the external result was failure, an internal transaction had occurred. He had offered up his bitterness, and it had been taken from him. The burden had lifted. It was not a feeling of victory over Paul, or even a sense of reconciliation. It was a profound, personal unshackling. He had taken his first stumbling step in applying the scripture, and in the face of outright rejection, he had found himself, for the first time in years, truly free. The strange, buoyant freedom David had discovered after his failed apology lingered like a clean scent after a storm. It was not happiness, not exactly, but a profound unclenching of his spirit that made the world seem sharper, the colors in his own living room more vibrant. Driven by this new sensation, he returned to his grandmother's Bible, his curiosity now a focused hunger. He remembered a phrase from a distant Sunday school memory, the fruits of the Spirit. He found it in Galatians, his fingers tracing the words as he read, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. The list felt less like an inventory and more like a diagnosis. He held each word up against the man he had been. Love? He had loved his family, he supposed, but as extensions of his own life, his own success. His love had been conditional, a quiet transaction. Joy? He could not remember the last time he had felt a pure, unadulterated joy, one not tied to a closed deal or a paid-off mortgage. His life had been a series of achievements, not celebrations. Peace? His mind had been a battleground of anxieties and strategic calculations for years. Patience was a virtue for those who had time to waste. His had been a resource meticulously managed and frequently depleted. Kindness, goodness, faithfulness. These were the attributes of saints in stained glass windows, not of a pragmatic accountant fighting for his slice of the world. Gentleness felt like weakness. Self-control was about denying dessert, not about mastering the torrent of frustration that so often threatened to overwhelm him. The realization was a cold, clear splash of water. His life was a barren tree. He had been so busy cultivating his career, his reputation, his financial security, that he had neglected the very soil of his soul. The fruits listed in Galatians were not spiritual luxuries. They were the essential markers of a life well lived, and his was a harvest of dust. The conviction to change was immediate and practical. He fetched a simple, lined notebook from a drawer. On the first page, he wrote the heading, "Cultivating the Fruit." He listed the 9 attributes, leaving space beneath each one. This would not be a diary of feelings, but a gardener's log, a record of intentional cultivation. He knew abstract goals would wither. He needed a specific daily training ground. His eyes settled on patience, and his mind immediately supplied the perfect chaotic crucible, his 7-year-old daughter's bedtime tantrums. That very evening, the test arrived on schedule. The plea for one more story escalated into a full-blown storm of tears and foot-stamping over the wrong pair of pajamas. The old David would have felt the familiar heat rise in his chest. He would have issued a sharp final command, his voice a blade of parental authority, leaving a frightened child and a residue of guilt in its wake. He felt the impulse now, the quick, easy path of anger. But he thought of the list in his notebook. He thought of the fruit of patience, described not as passive waiting, but as active endurance, a long-suffering that refused to be provoked. He took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the tension in his jaw. He did not speak. Instead, he knelt on the carpet, bringing himself to her level. He simply waited, his presence a quiet anchor in the tempest of her emotions. The storm raged for a moment longer, then began to subside into hiccuping sobs. He reached out and gently smoothed her hair, his touch calm and steady. He did not solve the pajama crisis with a decree. He helped her find another pair, his movements slow and deliberate. Later, after she was finally asleep, her face serene and tear-streaked, David opened his notebook. Beneath patience, he wrote a single, triumphant sentence. Did not yell, breathed, waited. It was a small victory, almost laughably insignificant in the grand scheme of his problems. Yet, as he looked at those few words, he felt a flicker of something he could only identify as the tender, green shoot of a new growth. It was not the full-grown fruit, but it was life. The internal transformation had begun, not with a dramatic revelation, but with a quiet decision on a child's bedroom floor. The leather-bound journal lay open on David's desk. its pages filled with the careful script of his spiritual observations. The small victories in patience with his daughter, the conscious efforts toward kindness, these were tender shoots in the newly tilled soil of his heart. Yet a larger, more daunting question loomed over his daily life, a question his journal could not answer. What was he to do with his career? Unemployment was a storm cloud darkening every moment of peace, its financial realities pressing in with relentless urgency. He had been an accountant, a man of numbers and predictable outcomes, and now he stood at a crossroads with no map, no spreadsheet to calculate the best path forward. His gaze fell upon his grandmother's Bible, its presence on the corner of his desk, now a comforting constant rather than a forgotten relic. He remembered a book within it, one spoken of with reverence for its practical guidance. He turned to Proverbs, the pages falling open to a section dense with his grandmother's underlinings and marginal notes. His eyes scanned the chapters, finding not esoteric theology, but earthy, direct counsel. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. The words from chapter 3 resonated with a profound clarity. Leaning on his own understanding had led to a dead end. His own plans, his own meticulous 5-year projections had evaporated overnight. The wisdom here was calling him to a different kind of calculus, one that factored in a variable he had never before considered: divine guidance. The idea felt both terrifying and exhilarating. He was being invited to make a decision not based solely on market analysis or salary potential, but on a trust that transcended his limited vision. That evening, after the house had settled into silence, he knelt beside his bed, a posture that felt foreign and awkward. He had no elegant words, no formal prayer. He simply laid his desperation before the silence, his whispered plea a raw and honest admission of his own confusion. He asked for discernment, for a clear mind, for wisdom to see the right path and the courage to walk it, even if it looked foolish by the world's standards. He prayed for a sign, not a lightning bolt, but a settled conviction in his spirit. In the days that followed, an idea, once a fleeting and dismissed fantasy, began to take root and grow with an insistence he could not ignore. For years, colleagues and acquaintances had casually sought his financial advice, not just on taxes, but on business plans, budgets, and strategic growth. He had always given it freely, a natural outflow of his skills. What if he formalized that? What if he started his own small consulting business, helping small businesses and nonprofits navigate their financial health? It was a terrifying prospect. It meant no guaranteed paycheck, no safety net, no prestigious firm name on his business card. It meant facing the very real possibility of public failure. The fear was a cold, heavy stone in his gut. He imagined the skeptical looks from former colleagues, the pitying glances from friends, the quiet worry in Sarah's eyes. He calculated the dwindling savings, the months they could survive without a steady income. Every logical, analytical part of his brain screamed that it was a reckless gamble. But beneath the fear, a different current was flowing, a deep and steady sense of rightness that felt entirely separate from his emotions. It was the conviction that had begun to grow after his prayer, a quiet assurance that this was the path being made straight for him. This was the wisdom he had asked for, not a guarantee of success, but a clear direction to walk in. One morning, with sunlight streaming into his office, he made the decision. His hand was steady as he opened a new document on his computer. At the top, he typed a single, momentous line: David Evans Consulting, Business Plan. It was a declaration of faith, a tangible step into the unknown. He was no longer just David's unemployed accountant. He was David, stepping out in faith, choosing to rely on a wisdom greater than his own. The fear did not vanish, but it was now accompanied by a newfound resolve, a sense that he was not walking this path alone. He was building his business not on the shifting sands of the economy, but on the foundation of a promise he was learning to trust. The familiar comfort of his morning routine, coffee, journal, Bible, felt different today, charged with an unspoken tension. David had been systematically working his way through the book of Matthew, each chapter peeling back another layer of his own soul, revealing both beautiful possibilities and uncomfortable truths. He turned to chapter 18, expecting more teachings on humility or community, his pen poised to note down another practical application. He read about becoming like little children to enter the kingdom of heaven, about the seriousness of causing others to stumble. Then his eyes found the parable, and the world seemed to shrink to the dimensions of the page. It was a story of staggering, asymmetrical mercy and breathtaking hypocrisy. A king forgives a servant an unimaginable debt, a sum so vast it could never be repaid in a dozen lifetimes. The servant, drowning in the relief of his own liberation, immediately seeks out a fellow servant who owes him a paltry, insignificant sum by comparison. He shows no mercy, demanding immediate payment and having the man thrown into prison. The king, upon hearing this, revokes his forgiveness and delivers the unforgiving servant to the jailers. The final words of the parable landed with the force of a physical blow. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. David's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the desk. The air left his lungs. He was not reading about ancient Middle Eastern debtors. He was reading his own biography. The king's forgiveness was the unearned grace he had been experiencing these past weeks, the peace that surpassed his circumstances, the lifting of burdens he could not carry himself, and the paltry debt? It had a name, a face, a history. It was his older brother, Mark. The inheritance dispute after their father's death had been a clean, surgical cut that had severed their relationship. It was not about the money, not really. It was about perceived favoritism, old childhood rivalries that had festered into adult resentment. Mark had gotten the vintage car David had coveted. David had received a slightly larger cash sum. They had argued bitterly, words spoken that could not be unspoken, accusations that had solidified into unassailable facts in both their minds. For 5 years, they had existed in a state of armed truce, communicating only through terse family group texts, their shared history reduced to a single, festering wound. Now, sitting in the quiet of his office, David felt the full weight of the parable press down upon him. He saw himself with terrifying clarity as the unforgiving servant. He, who had been forgiven a debt of existential despair and granted a new beginning, was still clutching the ledger of his brother's offense, nursing the grudge as if it were a prized possession. The conviction was not a gentle nudge, it was a divine crowbar prying his fingers from a box he had kept locked for half a decade. He felt a clear, undeniable prompting in his spirit, a single, insistent word: reconcile. The internal conflict that erupted was immediate and violent. A wave of defensive arguments crashed over him. Mark started it. He was unfair. He never apologized. He doesn't deserve my forgiveness. The old anger, carefully preserved and tended to, flared to life, hot and righteous. To reach out would be to admit weakness, to surrender the moral high ground he felt he so justly occupied. What if Mark rejected him? What if he laughed just as Paul had? The humiliation would be 1,000 times worse coming from his own brother. He stood up, pacing the small room, his heart a battlefield. One moment, the memory of the parable's warning, the revoked forgiveness, the jailers, sent a chill down his spine. The next, the memory of Mark's smug expression during their last argument made his fists clench. He looked at his journal, at the entries about peace and patience. It all felt like a beautiful, fragile sculpture that was about to be shattered by this one, unyielding pillar of bitterness. He could not have both. He could not cultivate the fruits of the Spirit while the root of unforgiveness poisoned the soil. He stopped at the window, staring out at the quiet street without seeing it. The choice was laid bare before him. He could continue to be the jailer of his own heart, guarding the prison where he kept his brother captive, a prison that, in truth, held only himself. Or he could take the terrifying, humbling step of unlocking the door, of offering a forgiveness that was not earned, that made no logical sense, simply because he himself had been the recipient of a forgiveness so much greater. The internal war raged, but beneath the storm of his pride and fear, the quiet, steady voice of conviction remained, calling him to a freedom that could only be found on the other side of obedience. The path forward was clear, and it led directly to a past he had tried desperately to forget. The phone felt like a block of ice in David's hand, its smooth surface betraying the seismic shift its use would represent. For 3 days, the parable of the unforgiving servant had haunted him, its truth a ghost that followed him from the quiet of his office to the chaos of the dinner table. He could not read another verse, could not write another journal entry until he had confronted this. The debt he held against Mark was the one ledger he had refused to close, its balance a poison that tainted every other attempt at spiritual growth. The choice was no longer abstract. It was a physical act, a number he had not dialed in years, waiting in his contacts list like a buried landmine. He waited until the house was empty, the silence amplifying the frantic drumming of his own heart. His thumb hovered over Mark's name. Every instinct, every fiber of his pride screamed at him to put the phone down, to preserve the cold, familiar comfort of his resentment. But the image of the forgiven servant, so freshly liberated yet so quick to enslave another, rose in his mind. He took a shuddering breath, a silent, desperate prayer on his lips, and pressed the call button. The ringing was an eternity. When Mark's voice finally came through the line, it was clipped, guarded, the voice of a man expecting a solicitor or a problem. "David?" The single word was laden with 5 years of silence and suspicion. David's own voice was tight, the words stumbling out. He explained that he'd been doing a lot of thinking, that he wanted to clear the air, that he was sorry for his part in their estrangement. The silence that followed was heavier than the one before the call, a thick, hostile void. Mark's response was not anger, but a cold, dismissive skepticism. He questioned David's motives, suggesting this was just another ploy, perhaps related to money or some newfound desperation. The old, familiar heat of defensiveness flared in David's chest, the urge to retaliate, to list all the ways Mark had been the one at fault. But he clenched his jaw, remembering the jailers from the parable, and forced himself to breathe. He did not argue. He simply repeated his desire to meet, to talk face to face, his voice straining to remain calm and steady against the tide of his brother's cynicism. Another long pause, then a grudging, reluctant agreement. A neutral coffee shop was suggested, a time set for the following afternoon. The call ended with a terse confirmation, not a farewell. David lowered the phone, his hand trembling. The conversation had been a minefield of tension, a verbal dance where every step risked an explosion. He felt emotionally flayed, the raw vulnerability of his apology having been met with a wall of ice. Yet, as the adrenaline subsided, he realized he had done it. He had taken the first, most difficult step. The door, however slightly, was now ajar. The coffee shop the next day was a study in quiet normalcy, a stark contrast to the storm raging within David. He arrived early, choosing a table in the corner, his knee bouncing nervously under the table. When Mark walked in, the sight of him was a physical blow. He looked older, his face more lined, his shoulders set in the same stubborn posture David remembered. Their eyes met, and for a moment they were just two brothers regarding a stranger. The first few minutes were agonizingly polite, a stilted exchange about traffic and the quality of the coffee. The chasm between them felt unbridgeable. Then David set his cup down, the click of ceramic on, wood a decisive sound. He looked directly at Mark, his guard down, his voice soft. He didn't rehash the old argument or assign blame. Instead, he spoke of the emptiness he had felt after losing his job, of the profound sense of failure, and of the unexpected journey he had begun with their grandmother's Bible. He told him about the parable, about seeing himself as the unforgiving servant, and how he could not move forward in his own life while still holding the past against him. Mark listened, his initial defensiveness slowly giving way to a wary curiosity. The mention of their grandmother seemed to touch a shared, softer memory. Then, haltingly, he began to speak. He talked about his own struggles, about the pressure he had felt as the older brother, about regrets of his own. The conversation was not a dramatic, tear-filled reconciliation. It was messy, fragmented, and painfully honest. There were moments of lingering bitterness, old wounds that were poked and prodded. But for the first time in years, they were not arguing. They were listening. When they finally stood to leave, the air between them was different. The hostility had dissipated, replaced by a tentative, fragile truce. They did not hug. The chasm was too wide for that. But they shook hands, the grip firm, lasting a moment longer than was strictly necessary. It was an acknowledgment of a shared history, both the good and the bad, and a silent agreement to no longer be its prisoners. Walking back to his car, David felt a profound and complex exhaustion. It was not the full, miraculous healing he might have secretly hoped for. The relationship was still fractured, a delicate thing that would require time and care to mend. But the prison door was open. The ledger was closed. He had practiced the forgiveness he had been taught, offering it not because it was deserved, but because he himself had been so lavishly forgiven. It was a partial healing, a beginning, and in that vulnerable, grace-filled space, David felt a deeper peace than any he had yet known. The peace that comes not from a resolved conflict, but from an obedient heart. The tentative peace David had forged with his brother felt like a newly cleared path in a dense, overgrown forest. It was rough and unfamiliar, but it allowed light to reach the ground for the first time in years. This small victory in one relationship cast a revealing light on all the others, and his gaze turned almost inevitably to the one that should have been his safest harbor, his marriage. He returned to his grandmother's Bible with a new question, not about forgiveness or wisdom, but about the very nature of the bond he shared with Sarah. His fingers found the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians, a passage he had heard read at countless weddings, its words so familiar they had become almost decorative, like lace on a tablecloth. He began to read, and this time the words did not feel like a gentle ideal or a beautiful poem. They felt like a mirror, and the reflection staring back at him was a devastating indictment. Love is patient, love is kind. He held those two attributes against the backdrop of his recent life. Patience? He had been a man of simmering frustration, his temper a low flame constantly fed by work stress and personal disappointment. He had snapped at Sarah over misplaced keys, over a delayed dinner, over the simple, human noise of their family life. Kindness. His kindness had been transactional, a currency dispensed when he felt appreciated, withdrawn when he felt burdened. He had offered comfort only when it was convenient. His attention, a scarce resource, he doled out sparingly. The passage continued, each line a precise, surgical strike. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. He thought of the silent, resentful comparisons he had made when Sarah seemed content in her own world, untouched by the professional pressures that consumed him. He remembered boasting of his accomplishments not to share joy, but to assert his value in the household. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. How many times had he dismissed her concerns as trivial compared to his own? How often had his decisions, from major financial moves to minor weekend plans, been made with his own comfort and preferences as the primary unspoken factor? It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. This was the most painful cut of all. His mind presented him with a ledger, not of his brother's offenses, but of Sarah's, a mental list of every perceived slight, every forgotten chore, every time she had failed to read his mood or meet his unspoken expectations. He had kept this record meticulously, using it to justify his own coldness, his own retreats into silence. He had loved her not as 1 Corinthians described, but as a critic loves a performance, always assessing, always finding flaw. The realization was a cold wave of shame that left him trembling. He had been a successful accountant, a provider of a comfortable home, a man who could point to tangible evidence of his care. But according to this radical definition, he had not been loving his wife. He had been managing a partnership, one in which he had appointed himself the senior manager. The love described here was not a feeling or an arrangement. It was a series of deliberate, self-sacrificing actions. It was a verb, not a noun. The conviction that settled over him was not one of despair, but of clear-eyed purpose. He could not undo the past, but he could redefine the future. He would not make a grand, empty declaration to Sarah. He would not try to manufacture a feeling he did not consistently possess. Instead, he would commit to the actions, trusting that the heart would follow. He would learn to love her according to this new, challenging blueprint, starting with the smallest, most practical expressions of service. That evening, he did not announce his epiphany. He simply observed. He saw the tired slope of Sarah's shoulders as she cleared the dinner dishes after a long day of her own. The old David would have retreated to his office, claiming pressing work. The new David stood up, took the stack of plates from her hands, and quietly said he would handle the kitchen. The surprise in her eyes was a brief, fleeting thing, but it was real. He washed the dishes not as a chore, but as an act of worship. Each scrub of a pot, a silent apology. Each rinsed glass, a small offering of the kindness he had so long withheld. It was a minuscule act, almost laughable in its simplicity. But as he placed the last clean plate in the cupboard, he felt a shift within himself, a quiet unlocking. It was the first brick laid in a new foundation, a foundation built not on what he could get, but on what he could faithfully, patiently, and kindly give. The slow-moving sedan was a red beacon of provocation in the fast lane, its driver blissfully unaware of the line of frustrated vehicles stacking up behind it. David's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles bleaching white. The old familiar script began to play in his mind, a symphony of muttered curses, a plan to aggressively swerve around the obstruction the moment a gap appeared, a burning sense of righteous indignation that his time was being so carelessly disrespected. The heat of impatience, his default setting for decades, began to rise in his chest like a fever. But then his eyes flicked to the small handwritten note he had taped to his dashboard that very morning. It held a single, stark word: patience. It was his battlefield reminder, his anchor in the daily storm of minor irritations. He took a long, slow breath, consciously unclenching his jaw. He remembered the teaching from James about considering it pure joy when facing trials of many kinds, because the testing of faith produces perseverance. This crawling traffic was his trial, a ridiculous, mundane test of his newfound resolve. He forced his foot to ease off the accelerator, creating a more generous following distance. He did not change lanes. He simply waited, his gaze fixed ahead, allowing the frantic energy to drain from his body. The driver in the slow sedan eventually noticed their error and moved over with a sheepish wave. David gave a small, calm nod in return, a gesture that felt foreign but strangely powerful. The victory was microscopic, but it was real, a skirmish won against the tyranny of his own haste. The real crucible, however, awaited him at home. His son, Liam, was sprawled at the kitchen table, his brow furrowed in a storm cloud over a worksheet of third-grade math problems. What should have been a 10-minute task was stretching into a half-hour saga of eraser marks, heavy sighs, and escalating frustration. The old David would have hovered, his presence a pressure cooker of expectation. He would have pointed, corrected, his voice sharpening with each wrong answer until the lesson dissolved into tears and slammed books. He felt the impulse now, the desire to simply grab the pencil and solve the problem himself, to efficiently erase the obstacle. Instead, he pulled up a chair. He sat beside Liam, not over him. He kept his hands in his lap, his voice a low, steady murmur. Take your time. Look at it again. When Liam scribbled out another incorrect calculation, David did not sigh. He simply said, "That was a good try. Let's see why that didn't work." He guided with questions, not commands, turning the frustrating dead end into a collaborative puzzle. It was agonizingly slow. Every cell in his body, trained for efficiency and results, screamed at the inefficiency. But he held his ground, his own patience a quiet fortress against the tempest of his son's learning struggle. There were setbacks. Days later, stuck in an interminable bank line, the old anger flared with a vengeance when a customer ahead of him initiated a complex, time-consuming transaction. The bitter words were on his tongue, a caustic comment about poor planning. He bit them back, the taste of his own impatience sour in his mouth. He had failed. The note on the dashboard seemed to mock him. The frustration felt like a regression, proof that his efforts were just a thin veneer over his true impatient nature. In the quiet of his office that evening, the weight of his failure pressed down on him. The conscious effort to rewire a lifetime of habit was exhausting. He felt like Sisyphus, pushing the boulder of his temperament up a hill only to watch it roll back down again. It was in this moment of discouragement that he remembered the other part of his new practice. He closed his eyes, bowing his head over his clasped hands. His prayer was not eloquent, just a raw, honest plea for strength. He did not ask for the removal of slow drivers or difficult homework. He asked for the fortitude to meet them with a spirit he knew he could not manufacture on his own. He asked for a patience that was not his own, but one that could be lent to him moment by frustrating moment. The next day, the homework session arrived again. The same struggles, the same sighs. But this time, David felt a difference. The internal tension was less. The urge to take over was a whisper, not a shout. He found himself able to wait in genuine silence, giving Liam the space to think without feeling the heat of paternal judgment. He saw the exact moment when his son's eyes lit up with understanding, the concept finally clicking into place. It was not a dramatic turnaround, but a gradual improvement, like the slow, imperceptible growth of a tree. The victory was not in the solved math problem, but in the peaceful process that led to it. David was learning that patience was not the absence of frustration, but the choice to act within it. And with each small choice, supported by whispered prayers for strength, he felt the roots of this new fruit digging a little deeper into the soil of his character. The world had always been a ledger to David, a complex but ultimately solvable equation of cause and effect, risk and reward. His entire life had been an exercise in control, in meticulously balancing the columns of his career, his finances, and his relationships. Unemployment had thrown a chaotic, unsolvable variable into that equation, and despite his fledgling consulting business and the tender shoots of personal growth, the underlying anxiety remained, a low-grade hum of uncertainty about the future. He was trying to trust, but a part of him was still frantically scribbling calculations in the margins, trying to force the numbers to add up. It was against this backdrop of lingering fear that he turned to the book of Romans and found himself confronted with a concept that dismantled his entire worldview: the sovereignty of God. He read the 8th chapter slowly, his analytical mind grappling with the sheer, breathtaking scope of its claims. The passage spoke of a reality where every detail, from the grand sweep of history to the minute struggles of the human heart, was held within a divine and loving plan. It spoke of a God who worked all things together for the good of those who loved him, not just the pleasant things, but the painful, confusing, and broken things as well. The words, all things, seemed to pulse on the page, encompassing his failed career, his strained reconciliation with Mark, his financial fears, and even his daily battles with impatience. It was a promise that his life was not a random series of events, but a narrative being authored by a wisdom infinitely greater than his own. The struggle was immediate and profound. His accountant's soul rebelled. How could a layoff be for his good? How could months of fruitless job searching and gnawing self-doubt be part of a benevolent plan. The idea felt like a spiritual bypass, a demand to ignore the very real pain of his circumstances. He wrestled with the text, arguing with its logic, feeling the old familiar urge to seize back the controls, to find a way to fix everything himself. But as he read on, a shift began to occur. The chapter did not ask him to understand the plan, only to trust the planner. It spoke of a future glory that outweighed present sufferings, painting a picture of a hope that was not a flimsy wish, but a solid, unshakable certainty. It declared that nothing, not hardship, not distress, not unemployment, not even death itself, could separate him from the love of God that was in Christ, the love that was orchestrating this mysterious, sovereign plan. The burden of his life was not his to carry alone. It was already held in a hand that had woven the cosmos. He closed the Bible, the weight of the book feeling different in his hands. It was no longer just a source of personal improvement tips, but a window into a reality where he was not the central manager, but a beloved participant. He walked to the window of his home office, looking out at the quiet, suburban street. The same fears were there, whispering of bills and an uncertain future. But something fundamental had changed within him. It was a release, a profound and physical unclenching of his spirit. He had been trying to surrender specific problems, his job, his anger, his impatience. Now he was being invited to surrender the very illusion of control itself. He didn't pray for a job. He didn't pray for a client. He simply stood there, and with an honesty that felt both terrifying and liberating, he whispered into the quiet room, "It's yours." The words were a transaction. He was handing over the ledger, the unsolvable equation, the entire tangled mess of his life. He was acknowledging that the one who spoke galaxies into being was more than capable of writing the next chapter of David Evans. A peace different from any he had yet experienced settled over him. It was not the absence of trouble, but a deep, resonant calm at the very center of the storm. It was the peace of knowing that his future was not a question mark, but a promise held in sovereign hands. The uncertainty remained, but its power to terrorize him was broken. He was no longer a man desperately trying to steer a ship through a hurricane. He was a passenger on a vessel whose captain knew the course, even when all David could see were the towering waves. For the first time since his crisis began, he felt not just hope, but a solid, unshakable foundation beneath his feet. He was learning to trust not in a positive outcome, but in the person who held the outcome. The peace of surrender was not a passive state, but a fertile ground for action. David's decision to trust in a sovereign plan had not erased the practical realities of his life. Instead, it had reframed them. The idea for his consulting business, once a terrifying gamble, now felt less like a risk and more like a response, a step of obedience onto a path he was being invited to walk. The final catalyst came from the 11th chapter of Hebrews, a passage his grandmother had titled in the margin, "The Hall of Faith." He read of Abel, Enoch, and Noah, ordinary people who built altars, built arks, and moved to unknown lands, all because they trusted a voice they could not see and a promise not yet fulfilled. They were not lauded for their safe choices, but for their radical, illogical obedience. They saw the promises from a distance, the text said, and welcomed them. David saw his own promise from a distance, a life of purpose that leveraged his skills for good, free from the soul-crushing corporate politics. To welcome it, he had to act. He could no longer treat his business plan as a theoretical exercise. It was time to build the ark, even though there was not a cloud in his financial sky. The fear was a cold, familiar presence, whispering of humiliation and failure, of draining their savings into a futile venture. It painted vivid pictures of having to admit defeat to Sarah, to Mark, to all the skeptical voices from his past. He fought the fear not with positive thinking, but with the very weapon the Hall of Faith provided, the Word of God. He began to memorize verses, not as magical incantations, but as foundational truths to anchor his soul when the winds of doubt began to howl. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. He wrote this from Hebrews 11:1 on an index card and propped it on his monitor. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. This promise from Deuteronomy became his daily mantra, repeated under his breath as he worked. The official launch was not a grand event with a ribbon cutting and champagne. It was a quiet, solemn moment in his home office. With a final prayer for courage, he clicked the publish button on his simple website. He sent a carefully worded email to his modest network of contacts, announcing the launch of David Evans Consulting. Each click of the mouse felt like the driving of a nail into the ark. He was committing. He was stepping out of the boat and onto the water, his eyes fixed not on the churning waves of the economy, but on the one who had called him to come. A profound silence followed. The website went live into the vast emptiness of the internet. The emails disappeared into crowded inboxes. The fear returned, a specter pointing at the blank client calendar. But this time, it was different. The fear was present, but it was no longer in charge. Beneath it, like the deep, solid bedrock beneath shifting topsoil, was a newfound confidence. It was not confidence in his business acumen or his marketing strategy. It was confidence in the faithfulness of the God of Noah, who called a man to build a boat on dry land, and of Abraham, who set out for a place he would later receive as his inheritance. David had taken his step of faith. The outcome was not his to control, but the obedience was. And in that obedience, he found a courage he never knew he possessed, a courage forged not in the absence of fear, but in the presence of a promise. The silence that followed the launch of his website stretched into days, each one a slow ticking test of his newfound faith. David refreshed his email inbox with a frequency that bordered on compulsion, the blank screen a mocking reflection of his empty calendar. The fear, that old and familiar adversary, whispered that he had been a fool, that his step of faith had been a step off a cliff into professional oblivion. He clung to the memorized verses, repeating them like a mantra against the rising tide of doubt. But the tangible evidence of his obedience remained frustratingly absent. Then, on a rainy Thursday morning, it arrived. Not a flashy corporate offer, but a simple, thoughtful inquiry from the director of a local nonprofit, a community outreach center called the Harbor. They needed help untangling their bookkeeping, preparing for an annual audit, and creating a sustainable financial model. Their budget was modest, their needs were real, and their tone was humble. As David read the email, a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so distinct and powerful it stole his breath. It was more than relief. It was a profound, soul-deep confirmation. This was not a random event in a chaotic universe. This was an answer, a direct and personal response to the step he had taken. The God who had called Noah to build an ark had just sent the first dove back with an olive leaf. The meeting was set for the following Monday at the harbor itself, a converted old house in a part of the city that had seen better days. The walls were scuffed, the furniture was donated and mismatched, but the air hummed with a palpable sense of purpose. David sat across from Eleanor, the director, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a weary but determined posture. As they discussed her organization's financial challenges, David felt a surprising clarity descend upon him. The numbers, the spreadsheets, the tax codes, it was all the language he knew, but now it was being used for a purpose that felt sacred. He was not just balancing books, he was helping to keep a lifeline open for people in need. Eleanor, perceptive and warm, noticed the difference in him. She commented that he didn't seem like the typical consultant, that there was a calmness about him. The opening was there, gentle and unforced. Taking a quiet breath, David began to share. He didn't preach or proselytize. He simply told his story. He spoke of the despair of unemployment, the emptiness that success had masked, and the unexpected discovery of his grandmother's Bible. He described the journey since then, the struggle to forgive, the redefinition of love, the terrifying decision to start this business as an act of trust. He presented it not as a formula, but as a testimony of a life being slowly, graciously put back together. Eleanor listened, her hands folded on the table, her initial professional demeanor softening into something more personal. When he finished, there was a moment of quiet in the sunlit room. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, which she brushed away with a self-conscious smile. She told him that she had been praying for a sign, for some encouragement that their work at the harbor mattered, that they weren't just spinning their wheels. His story, his journey from despair to purpose, felt like that very sign. His faith had confirmed his own path, and in the sharing, it had become a source of encouragement for hers. Walking back to his car, the modest contract safely in his briefcase, David felt a wave of gratitude so intense it was almost dizzying. The first client was not merely a business transaction. It was a sacred milestone. It was a tangible token of grace, a reminder that his obedience was seen and provided for. He wasn't just building a consulting firm. He was participating in a larger story, one where his own brokenness could, in some small way, become a source of strength for others. The confirmation of his faith was not just in the signed contract, but in the shared moment of human connection it had facilitated, a moment where his story had become a part of someone else's hope. The confirmation of his first client had been a solitary flame, a private validation of his fragile faith. But David knew a single flame, however bright, was easily extinguished by the next strong wind of doubt or difficulty. The desire for a steadier, shared light drew him toward the announcement in the church bulletin he had been cautiously eyeing for weeks: a weekly men's Bible study, meeting in the fellowship hall. The thought of walking into a room full of strangers, of laying bare his nascent and often confusing spiritual journey, sent a familiar chill of social anxiety down his spine. He was a man who had built his life on self-reliance and professional detachment, not on vulnerable confession. Yet, the memory of Eleanor's tearful gratitude, of how his story had resonated with hers, whispered that growth was not meant to be a solitary cultivation. He arrived early the following Tuesday evening, the scent of old coffee and polished linoleum filling the spacious hall. A dozen men of varying ages were arranged in a loose circle of folding chairs, their conversations a low, comfortable hum. He took a seat near the door, an escape route firmly in mind, and clutched his grandmother's Bible like a shield. The study leader, a retired teacher named Robert, with a gentle voice and eyes that held a deep, settled peace, opened with a prayer that was less a performance and more a simple, conversational reaching out. Then he posed a question to the group from the book of James, a passage about being quick to listen and slow to speak. He asked what that looked like in their own marriages and workplaces. What followed was not a theological debate or a dry lecture. One by one, men began to share. A young father confessed his struggle to truly listen to his wife after a long day, his mind still buzzing with work problems. A contractor described the challenge of controlling his temper with a difficult subcontractor, admitting he had failed just that morning. An elderly man spoke softly about the patience required to care for his wife with dementia, his love for her etched into every weary line on his face. They were not presenting sanitized versions of themselves. They were offering up their real-world struggles, their failures, and their small, hard-won victories, all held against the mirror of Scripture. The atmosphere was one of profound safety, a fellowship built not on shared perfection, but on shared need. When Robert's kind eyes eventually turned to him, David's throat tightened, but the courage he had prayed for moments before the meeting seemed to arrive, a quiet infusion of strength. He cleared his throat, his voice initially hesitant. He began to speak, not as an expert, but as a fellow traveler. He shared about the severance package that had shattered his identity, the unexpected comfort of the Beatitudes, and the terrifying, freeing step of starting his own business. He talked about the ledger of wrongs he had kept against his wife and the ongoing daily battle to practice patience. He even mentioned the painful, partial reconciliation with his brother. As he spoke, he saw nods of understanding, not of judgment. His story, which had felt so unique and isolating in the confines of his home office, was simply another variation on a universal theme: the human struggle for meaning, connection, and grace. After he finished, an accountant across the circle, a man named Ben, leaned forward. He shared how a similar passage in Philippians had guided him through his own career transition years ago, and offered a piece of practical advice about business licensing that David had been worrying over. Another man, a quiet mechanic, simply said, "I've been there with the anger. It's a beast. Praying for you, brother." In that moment, David understood the true power of community. The Bible's teachings were no longer just abstract principles in a leather-bound book. They were living, breathing realities being worked out in the lives of the men around him. He was gaining insights not just from the text, but from the weathered, grace-tested lives of those who were also trying to apply it. The study was not about acquiring more information, but about being formed together. Walking out into the cool night air an hour later, David felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. The solitary flame of his faith had been brought into a circle of other fires, and together they cast a brighter, steadier light, illuminating the path ahead with the shared glow of fellowship and growth. The invitation arrived like a relic from a past life, a college reunion, a gathering of faces he hadn't seen in 20 years, all of them preserved in his memory as they were then, ambitious, sharp, and fiercely secular. For a moment, David considered declining. The man they remembered, the driven, cynical accounting major who debated philosophy and mocked any hint of sentimentality, felt like a stranger to him now. But a quiet conviction stirred within him, a sense that his newfound faith was not meant to be hidden away like a secret shame, but to be lived in the very world that might scorn it. He accepted the invitation, a knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. The restaurant was a temple of polished brass and dark wood, the air thick with the clinking of glasses and the roar of collective nostalgia. For the first hour, it was easy. He fell into the familiar rhythms of old jokes and shared memories, the laughter feeling almost genuine. The questions about his career came as he knew they would. He answered honestly, speaking of losing his job and starting his own consulting business. He kept his tone light, focusing on the practicalities. But when he mentioned, almost in passing, that his faith had been a source of strength through the transition, the atmosphere at the table shifted palpably. It was Mark, his old debate partner, who launched the first volley, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Faith?" he said, the word dripping with amused condescension. "You, David? I never thought I'd see the day. I always pegged you for a man who believed in spreadsheets, not saviors." A few others chuckled, the sound brittle and uncomfortable. Another friend, Chloe, leaned in, her expression one of clinical curiosity. It's a common psychological coping mechanism, you know. When reality becomes too difficult, the mind creates a benevolent overseer, a crutch for when your own legs give out. The words crutch landed with the force of a physical blow, echoing in the sudden silence that had fallen over their corner of the table. David felt his face grow warm, a flush of humiliation and defensive anger rising in his chest. The old David would have risen to the bait, would have engaged in a cutting intellectual debate, dismantling their arguments with cold logic and leaving them feeling foolish. He felt the old reflexes twitch, the sharp retorts forming on his tongue. But the new David, the one who had journaled about gentleness and practiced patience, felt those words wither before they could be spoken. He simply looked at their faces, seeing not malice so much as a profound, uncomprehending pity. They saw his faith as a sign of weakness, a regression into childish dependency. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and hollow conversation. The laughter now sounded tinny, the camaraderie a thin veneer over a chasm of worldview. He left as early as he could, the cool night air doing little to soothe the sting of their mockery. Driving home, the doubts they had sown began to sprout like poisonous weeds in his mind. Were they right? Was this all just an elaborate psychological construct, a crutch he had fashioned because he couldn't stand on his own? Had he traded his intellectual integrity for a comforting fairy tale? The peace he had worked so hard to cultivate felt fragile, threatened by the cynical laughter of his past. He didn't go to bed. He went to his office, the sanctuary where his journey had begun. The mockery had created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed a cold, familiar emptiness. He reached for his grandmother's Bible, his movements heavy with dejection. He didn't know where to turn, so he let the book fall open, his eyes landing in the Psalms. His gaze fell upon the 55th Psalm, and he began to read the anguished cries of David, a king feeling betrayed and surrounded by enemies. My thoughts trouble me, and I am distraught. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen on me. Fear and trembling have beset me. Horror has overwhelmed me. It was as if the ancient poet had reached across 3 millennia and penned the exact contours of his own heart. He was not alone in this feeling of being assailed, of having his faith ridiculed. He read on, through the raw emotion, until he came to verse 22. Cast your cares on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never let the righteous be shaken. The words did not erase the sting of the mockery, but they reframed it. The choice was laid bare before him. He could internalize their scorn, let it fuel his doubt and make him defensive and bitter, or he could do what the psalmist commanded, cast this care, this hurt, onto a God he was learning to trust. He could choose to see their mockery not as a verdict on his sanity, but as a test of his character. How would he respond? With the sharp-edged wit of his old self, or with the love he was striving to embody? The decision crystallized in the quiet of the room. He would not fight them. He would not try to win an argument. He would absorb their scorn without returning it. He would respond with kindness, with a gentle spirit that refused to be provoked. It would not be a victory they would understand, but it would be a victory nonetheless, a victory over his own pride, his own need for their approval. He closed the Bible, the weight of it solid and reassuring in his hands. The mockery had been meant to shatter his faith, but in the refining fire of their laughter, it had instead been tempered, moving from a private comfort to a public conviction he was willing to defend not with words, but with love. The memory of their mocking laughter was a bitter aftertaste that lingered for days, a ghost at the edge of David's newfound peace. The old defensive part of him wanted to craft a scathing email, a masterpiece of logical rebuttal that would eviscerate their arguments and leave them feeling small and foolish. He could almost hear the satisfying click of the send button, the momentary rush of vindication. But as he sat in the quiet of his morning study, the impulse felt hollow, a regression into the man he was trying to leave behind. The challenge was not to win a debate. It was to live out the very truths they had mocked. He opened his Bible, not for comfort this time, but for a battle plan. And his eyes fell upon the words of Jesus in the 5th chapter of Matthew, a passage he had read before, but now saw with startling new clarity. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. The command felt impossible. Rejoice in the face of humiliation? Be glad when friends looked at you with pitying condescension? Yet, the instruction was there, not as a gentle suggestion, but as a radical prescription for resilience. This was not about gritting his teeth and enduring. It was about a fundamental reorientation of his heart, a choice to see their mockery not as a personal attack, but as a confirmation that he was walking a path so counter to the world that it provoked confusion and scorn. His faith was being tested, not in the privacy of his study, but in the public square of his old life. The opportunity to stand firm arrived sooner than he expected. A week after the reunion, he received a group email from Mark, his old debate partner. It was a forwarded article, snarky and dismissive, about the psychological profiles of religious converts. The subject line read, "Thought this might be relevant to our recent discussions." It was a deliberate prod, a digital poke to see if David would flinch. The old heat of anger flashed through him, his fingers itching to type a furious reply, to defend his intellectual integrity. But he paused, breathing slowly, recalling the teaching. Patience, kindness. A soft answer turns away wrath. His response was not composed in a flash of inspiration, but crafted with deliberate, prayerful care. He thanked Mark for sharing the article, acknowledging that it raised interesting points about human psychology. He did not argue its premise. Instead, he wrote that his own experience had been less about finding easy answers and more about discovering a profound sense of peace and purpose that he had never found in his spreadsheets or career accolades. He concluded by saying he hoped they could catch up again soon on more pleasant terms, and that he wished him and his family well. He signed it simply, "Your friend David." He read it over once, his heart pounding, and clicked "send" before he could second-guess himself. The reply was not immediate. When it came, hours later, it was a single line. "Not the response I was expecting. You've changed." There was no apology, no further mockery, just a statement of stark observation. David could almost see the puzzled expression on Mark's face. His calm, kind demeanor had been a weapon they had no defense against. It had not convinced them, but it had disarmed them. Their scorn had met not with equal hostility, but with an unshakable, quiet confidence that left them with nothing to push against. That evening, David reflected on the entire encounter. He realized that Jesus' teachings about persecution were not a promise of escape from hardship, but a blueprint for navigating it with a spirit that remained unbroken. The goal was not to avoid the mockery, but to move through it without allowing it to dictate his reactions or steal his peace. By responding with kindness instead of anger, with patience instead of a cutting retort, he had not only protected his own heart from bitterness, but he had also borne witness to a different way of being. His resilience was not a stiff upper lip or a thick skin. It was a flexible, rooted strength that could bend in the storm without breaking. The mockery had come to shatter him, but in choosing to stand firm on the foundation of love, he had found himself stronger. His faith not a fragile crutch, but a pillar of unassailable peace. The quiet confidence David had discovered in the face of mockery felt like a fortress he had built, but he knew a fortress needed a constant open line of communication with its king. His journey had been one of reading, applying, and reacting, but he had yet to establish a consistent, proactive dialogue with the God he was learning to trust. The teachings of Jesus in Matthew 6, which he had read before in his early explorations, now called to him with a new urgency. He returned to the chapter, his eyes drawn to the intimate instructions on prayer. "But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you." The words painted a picture not of a public performance, but of a private audience, a conversation between a child and a loving parent. It was an invitation to intimacy, a call to bring his deepest fears and highest hopes into the quiet, unseen space of trust. He realized his prayers had been sporadic, crisis-driven whispers, pleas for help when he was overwhelmed, cries of gratitude when a burden lifted. They were reactions, not a relationship. The idea of a daily disciplined prayer routine felt both daunting and deeply necessary. It was the next logical step in his faith, the move from learning about God to communicating with Him. He decided to carve out a sacred space in his day, a non-negotiable appointment. The early morning, before the house stirred and the demands of his fledgling business began, became his designated time. He would wake, brew a single cup of coffee, and retreat to the small armchair in the corner of his bedroom, the first light of dawn painting soft stripes on the floor. The first few attempts were clumsy and awkward. He felt self-conscious, speaking into the silence, his mind a jumble of wandering thoughts about his to-do list. A difficult conversation with Sarah, or the lingering anxiety over his next client. He fumbled for the right words, trying to craft eloquent petitions. But as he persisted, day after day, the practice began to transform. He remembered Jesus' warning against babbling on like pagans, thinking they would be heard because of their many words. He stopped trying to perform and started simply to be present. He began to structure his prayers not as a monologue, but as a conversation, following the simple model Jesus had provided, praising God's character, surrendering to His will, asking for daily provision, seeking forgiveness and offering it to others, and requesting guidance and protection. He brought everything into that quiet space. He prayed for his business, not for a flood of clients, but for wisdom to serve the ones he had with integrity and excellence. He asked for discernment to make sound decisions and for the courage to walk through the doors that opened and the wisdom to accept the ones that closed. He prayed for his family, for Sarah's heart, for her own burdens that he was only beginning to understand. He asked for patience and gentleness with his children, for the strength to be the calm, loving father they needed, not the impatient, distracted one he had so often been. He even prayed for his brother Mark, asking for healing in their fractured relationship and blessing upon his life. As the days turned into a week and then two, the daily ritual ceased to be a discipline and became a lifeline. The act of verbally laying his concerns at the feet of an unseen Father created a tangible shift in his spirit. The weight of his responsibilities, which had once felt like a crushing load he carried alone, now felt shared. A profound sense of peace began to permeate his days, a steady undercurrent that remained even when circumstances were challenging. He was learning that the primary power of prayer was not in its ability to change his situation, but in its capacity to change him. It was in that quiet, consistent communication that his anxieties were soothed, his perspective was widened, and his trust was deepened. He was no longer just a man trying to follow a set of teachings. He was a man in a relationship, learning the language of the heart, discovering that the most powerful force in his transforming life was this simple, daily act of opening his own. The rhythm of David's new life had become a sacred cadence. The quiet dawn prayers, the focused work on his fledgling business, the intentional moments of patience with his family. Yet, beneath the surface of this hard-won peace, a low, persistent hum of financial anxiety remained. The modest contract with the harbor was a blessing, a confirmation, but it was not enough to fully silence the whispers of doubt about the long-term viability of his venture. He had been diligently applying, sending proposals and networking, but the responses were polite rejections or, more often, a deafening silence. Each evening, as he reviewed his accounts, the numbers told a stark story of a slowly depleting safety net. He brought this specific, gnawing worry to his morning prayers with a raw honesty, laying the spreadsheet of his fears before God, asking not for wealth, but for provision for the next step, for a door to open that would allow him to continue this work he felt called to do. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, its subject line innocuous. Following up. It was from a man named Robert Chen, the CFO of a mid-sized tech firm. David had done some freelance contract work for years ago, before his corporate career had fully taken off. Robert was a man David remembered as sharp, pragmatic, and impeccably professional. The email was warm, recalling their past collaboration favorably. Robert explained that his company was restructuring its financial oversight and was looking for an outside consultant to manage a specific, complex project, a comprehensive audit and efficiency analysis of their operational budgets. The role required a rare blend of meticulous accounting skills, strategic vision, and the ability to communicate complex data to non-financial stakeholders. It was, David realized with a growing sense of awe, a description of his exact skill set, honed over 20 years in the corporate world and now refined through his own entrepreneurial journey. The project timeline was flexible, perfect for his consulting schedule, and the fee being offered was more than generous. It was a lifeline. David sat back in his chair, the screen blurring before his eyes. This was not a random opportunity. It was an answer, so precise and timely, it felt orchestrated. The project was not something he had actively pursued. It had come to him from a forgotten corner of his professional past, tailored to the unique niche he occupied. The peace that washed over him was not the quiet calm of his morning prayers, but a vibrant, joyful certainty. This was a tangible, undeniable evidence of a hand guiding his path, of a prayer being met not with a vague sense of comfort, but with a concrete, practical solution. He saw the divine fingerprint all over it, the perfect alignment of need and gift, the timing that felt less like coincidence and more like providence. He could not contain the news. When Sarah returned home from her own work, he met her at the door, his face alight with a mixture of relief and exhilaration she had not seen in years. He led her to the kitchen table, the center of their family life, and recounted the entire story. He did not present it as a simple business victory. He told her about the specific prayer from that very morning, the whispered plea for provision. He showed her Robert's email, pointing out how the project requirements read like a biography of his career. He spoke of the timing, the fee, the way it dovetailed perfectly with his work at the harbor. His voice, usually so measured and practical, was filled with a passionate wonder. Sarah listened, her initial smile softening into something deeper, more profound. She saw not just the relief of financial pressure in his eyes, but a radiant, solidified faith. This was no longer the abstract trust of a man reading ancient texts. This was the lived experience of a man who had asked for bread and received it. She reached across the table and took his hand, her own eyes glistening. They had prayed together tentatively in recent weeks, but now Their joined hands felt like a circuit completing, a shared current of belief passing between them. Her own flickering faith, nurtured by watching his transformation, was fanned into a stronger flame by the tangible reality of this answered prayer. It was a milestone not just in his career, but in their shared spiritual journey, a stone of remembrance they could both look back upon in future times of doubt, a testament to the reality of a God who not only guided souls, but also met practical needs. In the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the mundane evidence of their life, they shared a moment of sacred strengthening wonder. The answered prayer of the consulting contract was a stone of remembrance, a tangible monument to God's faithfulness that David could point to in moments of doubt. Yet, he knew faith was not meant to be a treasure hoarded in a vault of personal blessing, but a currency to be spent in the service of others. The teachings of Jesus, which he had been absorbing like parched soil, were saturated with this very principle. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. The idea, once a noble abstraction, now stirred in him as a restless, compelling urge. He could no longer be a passive recipient of grace. He needed to become a conduit. His gaze turned from the spreadsheets on his screen to the needs of his city, and his search led him to the doors of the Hope Center, a homeless shelter on the other side of town. His first shift was on a blustery autumn evening, the air sharp with the promise of winter. Stepping inside was like crossing into a different world. The air was thick with the scent of industrial cleaner and simmering stew, a stark contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled environments of his past life. The noise was a symphony of shuffling feet, murmured conversations, and the clatter of trays, a raw, unfiltered humanity that both unnerved and captivated him. He was assigned to the serving line, handed a hairnet and an apron that felt like a costume of humility. As the line began to form, a queue of weathered faces and tired eyes, he felt a familiar professional distance try to assert itself. This was a problem to be observed, a social issue to be analyzed. But then the first person stood before him, an older man with gnarled hands and eyes that held a deep, weary history. David ladled stew onto his tray, their eyes meeting for a brief second. In that fleeting connection, the analytical distance shattered. This was not a statistic. This was a person, a story, a soul who had known joy and sorrow, who had dreams that had likely crumbled to dust, who was, in that moment, simply hungry. The simple act of providing a meal felt profoundly sacred, a direct application of the command to feed the hungry. A strange and unexpected joy began to bloom in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the steam from the food warmer. It was the joy of usefulness, of his two hands meeting a tangible need. As the evening wore on, he fell into a rhythm, his movements becoming less mechanical and more gracious. He made a point to look each person in the eye, to offer a soft, "You're welcome," instead of a grunt. He noticed the small things, the woman who carefully wrapped an extra roll in a napkin for later, the young man who helped an elderly patron carry his tray, the quiet dignity with which most people endured their circumstances. He was not just serving food, he was bearing witness to a reservoir of human resilience he had never paused to acknowledge. He listened to the fragments of conversation that drifted past him, stories of lost jobs, broken families, battles with addiction, stories that were not so different in their essence from his own, merely amplified by harsher consequences and fewer safety nets. His own crisis of unemployment, once the center of his universe, shrank to a manageable scale when viewed beside the raw survival playing out in this hall. At the end of his shift, his back ached and his feet were sore, but his spirit felt lighter than it had in months. The act of serving had been an exchange. He had given his time and his effort, but he had received something far greater in return, a profound sense of perspective and a deep soul-level connection to the people he had so often walked past without seeing. Driving home through the brightly lit streets of his own neighborhood, the warm glow from the houses felt different. He saw them not just as symbols of his own success or failure, but as shelters for other stories, other struggles. The empathy he had been trying to cultivate in his journal was no longer a theoretical concept. It was a muscle, stretched and strengthened by the weight of a ladle and the shared humanity of a meal. He had gone to the shelter to serve others as Jesus did, and in the simple, sacred act of handing a tray to a hungry man, he had found his own soul nourished in ways he never could have imagined. The circle of folding chairs in the church fellowship hall had become a sacred space, a confessional of shared struggles and quiet triumphs. This week, David felt a different kind of anticipation as he took his seat, the worn leather of his grandmother's Bible smooth and familiar against his palm. Robert, the study leader, had asked him earlier if he would be willing to share more of his journey, to trace the specific scriptural threads that had woven through the fabric of his transformation. The request had initially sent a flutter of nervousness through him, but as he prayed about it, the apprehension had settled into a calm resolve. His story was no longer just his own, it was a testament, and testimonies were meant to be given away. When Robert nodded to him, the room's gentle hum of conversation stilled. David took a steadying breath, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the men around him, men who had become brothers in spirit, their own vulnerabilities having paved the way for his trust. He began not with a theological argument, but with the visceral memory of staring at the severance envelope, feeling the absolute collapse of his identity. He described the hollow man who had then found his grandmother's Bible, a relic he'd expected to be dust, but which had instead become a wellspring. He held up the book, his fingers finding the penciled box he had drawn months ago around the Beatitudes in Matthew 5. He read the words aloud, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," and shared how that single phrase had been the first crack of light in its darkness, the first acknowledgement that his brokenness was not a disqualification, but an invitation. He moved then to the Sermon on the Mount, his voice gaining strength as he recounted the impossible command to love his enemies. He told them about the phone call to his former colleague Paul, the sting of rejection, and the miraculous, unexpected unshackling that followed. The realization that obedience to the teaching had freed him from a prison of his own making, regardless of the other man's response. Then he turned to Galatians, the page falling open to the 5th chapter. He read the list: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, and confessed how it had acted as a devastating diagnosis of his barren soul. He spoke of the journal, of the intentional, often frustrating work of cultivation, using the nightly battlefield of his daughter's math homework as his training ground for patience. He didn't paint himself as a hero. He painted himself as a gardener on his knees in the dirt, tending to fragile, new growth shoots with prayer and dogged persistence. His honesty was a key, unlocking something in the room. As he spoke, he saw nods of recognition, the softening of postures, the faint sheen of tears in one man's eyes. He wasn't presenting a finished product. He was displaying the raw materials of his ongoing renovation, the blueprint of Scripture laid over the messy construction site of his life. When he finished, a profound silence hung in the air, thick not with awkwardness, but with a shared sacred understanding. Then the dam broke. Ben, the fellow accountant, was the first to speak, his voice thick with emotion. He confessed that he, too, was clinging to a grudge against a business partner, and that hearing David's story made him feel both convicted and hopeful. Another man, a quiet electrician named Leo who rarely spoke, cleared his throat and shared in halting sentences his own struggle with a temper that frightened his family and his desire to know the peace David described. The conversation flowed freely then, a river of shared humanity, as other men opened up about their own battles with anxiety, pride, and the desperate search for purpose, each one connecting their story to the scriptural truths David had illustrated with his life. David listened, his heart swelling with a humble awe. He had come to share his story, and in the sharing, it had become a mirror in which others saw their own reflections and a window through which they glimpsed a possible way forward. His testimony had not been a lecture. It had been an ignition. The impact was visible in the raw honesty that filled the room, in the tentative offers of prayer, in the simple, powerful words, "Me too." He saw that the most powerful tool for change was not a perfectly articulated doctrine, but a life authentically lived in the light of grace, its scars and its healing offered up as evidence of a love that could truly transform a human heart. The act of sharing his story had been a crucible, forging the private metal of his faith into a public tool. David had laid bare his journey, and in the vulnerable, echoing silence that followed, he had felt not judged, but strangely validated. Yet, as the days passed, a quiet, persistent shadow began to creep back into the edges of his newfound confidence. It was a ghost from his own past, a specter that no amount of serving others or sharing testimonies could fully exorcise, the memory of his own failures. Not the recent dramatic failure of unemployment, But the older, more insidious ones, the small business he had launched with a friend a decade ago that had slowly bled out over 2 painful years, the ill-advised real estate investment that had collapsed during the last recession, taking a significant chunk of his and Sarah's savings with it. These were not injustices done to him, but mistakes authored by his own miscalculations, his own ambition, his own flawed judgment. He had forgiven others. He had received grace for his present struggles. But the ledger of his own past business failures remained open in a locked drawer of his mind, its numbers a permanent indictment of his competence and worth. He was a man saved by grace, yet he still lived under the self-imposed sentence of his own former foolishness. The weight of it was a subtle poison, tainting his current successes. Every compliment on his new consulting work was met with an internal whisper reminding him of his past collapse. Every step forward felt like a tightrope walk over the chasm of his previous falls. Driven by this lingering self-condemnation, he returned to the book of Ephesians, the same letter that had first introduced him to the concept of grace. He read the second chapter again about being saved by grace through faith, not by works. But this time, his eyes traveled further into the rich theological depths of the first chapter. He read about being chosen before the creation of the world, about being predestined for adoption, about the redemption and forgiveness that are lavished upon us with all wisdom and understanding. The language was vast, cosmic, speaking of a divine plan that stretched across eternity. And then a single phrase in chapter 2, verse 7, struck him with the force of a physical blow. It spoke of God's intent to show the incomparable riches of His grace, expressed in His kindness to us in Christ Jesus. The words, incomparable riches, seemed to glow on the page. He held them up against the paltry sum of his past business failures. The grace offered to him was not a limited fund, carefully rationed out for recent sins. It was an incomparable treasure, a boundless ocean meant to cover every debt, every mistake, every foolish miscalculation from every era of his life. His past failures were not exceptions to grace. They were specific, individual canvases upon which the vastness of that grace could be displayed. The realization was a slow dawning sunrise in his soul. If God's plan from eternity past included him, then it included all of him. The ambitious young man who had made rash investments, the desperate husband who had risked their security, the broken man who had found a Bible in his despair. All of it was woven into the tapestry of a grace that was not thwarted by human error, but was, in fact, magnified by it. He closed the Bible, the truth settling into the marrow of his bones. He walked to the filing cabinet in the corner of his office, the one that held the physical records of his old life. He found the folder labeled with the name of his defunct business. He pulled it out, the contents a dry, papery tomb of his ambition. He didn't shred it in a fit of catharsis. Instead, he opened it and looked, really looked, at the numbers that had once defined his shame. And as he did, he spoke the truth aloud, his voice firm in the quiet room. You are forgiven. You are covered by an incomparable grace. He was not just reading a theological concept, he was applying it as a balm to a specific festering wound, a freedom more profound than any he had yet experienced washed over him. It was the freedom of self-acceptance, the final relinquishment of the need to be the man who never failed. The acceptance he had craved from employers, from colleagues, from his own internal critic, was now given to him as a gift. He saw that God's grace was not just a safety net for his future stumbles, but a blanket of amnesty thrown over his entire past. The ledger was not just closed, it was incinerated in the furnace of a love that had known every failure before it happened and had chosen him anyway. He was not a man in spite of his past, but a man because of it. A man who knew the depth of his need and the greater depth of the grace that met it. The understanding was no longer intellectual, it was cellular. He was at last free. The freedom of self-forgiveness was a spacious new country in which David now lived, its horizons uncluttered by the old monuments to his past failures. This internal liberation naturally sought an external expression, a community where this hard-won grace could be shared and multiplied. His attendance at the weekly men's Bible study had been a toe in the water of fellowship. Now, he felt a compelling urge to dive into the full, flowing current of the church's life. It was no longer enough to be a passive recipient of sermons or a quiet participant in a small group. He felt a growing conviction to become a living stone in the spiritual house the New Testament described, a functional part of a body designed for mutual support and active love. His first step was to approach the pastor after a Sunday service. The conversation was not a request for a role, but an offering of availability. He described his journey, his skills as an organizer and an accountant, and his deep desire to serve. The pastor, a man whose eyes held the same deep peace as Robert's from the Bible study, listened intently. A week later, David found himself sitting in a planning meeting for the church's annual community outreach, a citywide event providing free meals, clothing, and medical checkups for the homeless and underprivileged. The room was filled with a diverse group of people, retirees, young parents, college students, all animated by a common purpose that transcended their differences. David was asked to join the logistics team, his analytical mind immediately spotting ways to streamline the donation tracking and volunteer scheduling. He was no longer just David the consultant. He was David, a part of the body, using his specific God-given abilities to serve the whole. The day of the outreach dawned bright and clear. The church parking lot transformed into a bustling hub of compassionate activity. David was stationed at the volunteer coordination table, a clipboard in hand and a headset, connecting him to team leaders across the site. He witnessed the church not as an institution, but as a living organism in motion. The youth group, teenagers, full of infectious energy, set up games for children. The elderly members of the prayer team moved through the crowds, offering quiet words of encouragement and laying gentle hands on weary shoulders. Medical professionals from the congregation donated their time in a makeshift clinic, while others served hot food with genuine smiles. He saw a mechanic from the men's study fixing a flat tire on a family's dilapidated car, and a woman who owned a local bakery distributing pastries she had baked before sunrise. In the midst of the organized chaos, David experienced the profound truth of the church as a body. The hand could not say to the foot, "I don't need you." His logistical skills were as vital as the doctor's stethoscope or the cook's ladle. They were all different parts, but one body, each member belonging to all the others. He saw how the encouragement flowed freely. A tired volunteer was relieved with a kind word. A struggling recipient was surrounded by supportive presence. A moment of frustration was met with patient grace. This was the mutual encouragement the Scriptures described, a tangible, dynamic network of support that strengthened the entire community. He was not just giving, he was receiving. The gratitude in the eyes of those they served, the camaraderie of his fellow volunteers, the shared sense of purpose. It all filled him with a joy that was deeper and more sustaining than any professional achievement had ever been. He was integrated, woven into the fabric of a faith community that saw his value not in what he had accomplished, but in who he was becoming together with them. The steady rhythm of answered prayers and growing purpose was a melody David had begun to trust, a harmonious backdrop to his new life. The consulting work was fulfilling, his family was thriving in the newfound peace of their home, and his integration into the church felt like a homecoming for his soul. He had built his ark of faith on the solid ground of God's promises, and for a glorious season the sun had shone upon it. But faith, he was about to learn, is not truly faith until it is all you're holding on to when the storm clouds gather and the first cold drops of rain begin to fall. The first warning was a polite but firm email from Robert Chen's company. Due to an unexpected market downturn and internal restructuring, the comprehensive audit project, the very answered prayer that had been his financial lifeline, was being put on an indefinite hold. The fee he had been counting on vanished from his forecast, leaving a gaping hole in his budget. Days later, a follow-up email arrived from the harbor. Their primary grant had not been renewed. They would need to pause their consulting contract immediately to reassess their own financial survival. In the span of a week, the two pillars of his fledgling business were knocked out from under him. The spreadsheets he opened now were not ledgers of hope, but maps of a rapidly approaching cliff. The numbers, once his comfort, now screamed of impending failure, of a return to the very despair from which he had been so miraculously lifted. A cold, familiar dread coiled in his stomach, tightening with each calculated projection. The old, cynical voice he thought he had silenced roared back to life. "See?" it hissed. It was all a house of cards, a comforting story you told yourself. God's plan? This is the plan? Financial ruin and humiliation? He stared out his office window, but the sunny day seemed a mockery. The peace he had cultivated felt like a phantom limb. a sensation he could remember but no longer feel. He questioned everything. Had he misread all the signs? Had his step of faith been nothing more than a foolish leap into an abyss? The God of provision and sovereign plans felt distant, a silent observer to the collapse of David's carefully rebuilt world. In the suffocating quiet of his panic, a single dog-eared page in his grandmother's Bible seemed to glow in his memory. It was Romans 8, the chapter that had once invited him to surrender control. He found it now with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the familiar words until they landed on the 28th verse, a verse his grandmother had underlined with a firm, steady hand. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. The words felt like a challenge, a direct contradiction to the evidence screaming from his computer screen. All things? How could the collapse of his business, the threat to his family's security, be worked for good? The battle within him was fierce. His circumstances shouted one reality. The quiet, persistent promise of Scripture whispered another. He had a choice: to trust the visible disaster or the invisible promise, to believe in the chaos or the controller of the chaos. He closed his eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could not manufacture a feeling of peace. He could not force himself to see the good. All he could do was choose which voice to believe. With a resolve that felt like lifting a mountain, he made his choice. He would trust the promise, not the panic. He would believe that the same God who had guided him to this point was still at work, even in the ruin of his plans. His prayer was not one of desperate pleading, but of raw, shaky surrender. He did not ask for a miraculous rescue. He asked for wisdom, for eyes to see the path forward, for the strength to endure the difficulty, and for the faith to believe that the one who had called him was still faithful, even when his methods were incomprehensible. It was a test, not of his business acumen, but of the very substance of his faith. And in the dark stillness of his office, with financial storm clouds gathering, David planted his feet on the promise and decided to trust. The storm of financial uncertainty did not break with a sudden, miraculous rescue. Instead, it settled into a low, persistent pressure, a gray sky of anxiety that threatened to eclipse the sunlit faith David had so carefully cultivated. The initial shock of the lost contracts gave way to a grinding daily reality of unanswered proposals and a dwindling bank balance. The old, familiar demon of doubt, which he thought he had vanquished, now stalked the edges of his mind with renewed vigor. It whispered in the quiet moments, suggesting that his entire spiritual journey had been a beautiful but fragile illusion, a psychological life raft he had built for himself that was now springing leaks under the weight of cold, hard reality. The promises from Hebrews 11, which had once fueled his step of faith, now felt like distant, ancient stories with no bearing on his modern-day crisis. How could the faith of Abraham, who was promised descendants as numerous as the stars, possibly relate to a 40-year-old accountant staring at an empty client calendar? He fought the doubt with the only weapons he had, prayer and the Word. But his prayers felt like shouts into a void, and the scriptures seemed to lie flat and lifeless on the page. He opened his grandmother's Bible to Hebrews 11, the hall of faith, and read the names again: Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham. He tried to muster the same courage they had, but all he felt was the vast chasm between their epic obedience and his own feeble, faltering trust. The doubt was a thick fog, obscuring the path ahead and making a mockery of the steps he had already taken. He felt like a man who had built a house on what he believed was solid rock, only to feel the foundations tremble at the first real earthquake. It was in this state of spiritual desolation that he remembered a marginal note his grandmother had scribbled beside a different verse. He flipped to the book of James, to the first chapter. His eyes found the second verse, which talked about considering it pure joy when facing trials, and he had to look away, the sentiment feeling impossibly distant. But his gaze dropped to verse 6, a stark command about asking God for wisdom, but asking in faith without doubting, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. The description was a perfect portrait of his own inner state. Tossed, unstable, driven by the changing winds of his circumstances. The verse was not a condemnation, but a diagnosis. His doubt was not a unique sin. It was a common human condition, a part of the growth process itself. The goal was not to never feel doubt, but to choose faith in the midst of it. This realization was a small crack in the fog. He stopped trying to argue with the doubt or pretend it wasn't there. Instead, he acknowledged it, named it, and then deliberately chose to lean on the promises he could not feel. He returned to Hebrews 11, but this time he focused not on the grand outcomes, but on the difficult process. The text said, "These heroes all died without receiving the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. They lived by faith, not by sight." David's sight showed him failure. His faith was being asked to see a promise he could not yet perceive. He began to pray not for the removal of his problems, but for the eyes to see the small, hidden signs of hope within them. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to see them. A former client, hearing of his situation, referred a small, one-off project his way. Not enough to save him, but enough to cover a month's mortgage. It was a pebble, but it was a pebble of provision. His wife, Sarah, who had once worried in silence, now sat with him in the evening, her hand in his, and prayed with a quiet strength that bolstered his own. That was a sign of a deeper, more resilient love growing in the soil of their shared trial. A man from his Bible study, who ran a small printing business, offered him free updated marketing materials, a simple act of fellowship that felt like a hand on his shoulder. These were not thunderous miracles, but they were small, steady drips of grace, each one a tiny star piercing through the fog of his doubt. He was learning that doubt was not the opposite of faith. It was its refining fire. It burned away the flimsy, circumstantial faith that depended on everything going well and forged in its place a deeper, more resilient trust, a trust that was not in a positive outcome, but in the unchanging character of God. His faith was no longer a feeling, but a choice, a deliberate leaning on the promises of Hebrews 11, even when his bank account screamed a different story. The financial storm had not passed, but David was no longer a wave tossed by the wind. He was becoming an anchor, dug deep into the seabed of God's faithfulness, holding fast through the storm, his trust deepening with every crashing wave. The financial storm had not broken, but David had found an anchor in the midst of it. The deliberate choice to trust, even as the numbers on his spreadsheet continued their grim decline, had forged a new kind of resilience in his soul. It was in this state of surrendered trust that he encountered a passage that felt less like an instruction and more like an invitation to a secret he had been missing. He turned to 2 Corinthians 9, and the word seemed to lift off the page, challenging the very foundation of his accountant's mindset. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. The concept of cheerful giving, while staring into the abyss of his own financial uncertainty, felt like a paradox, a spiritual logic that defied all his worldly calculations. He read about the principle of sowing and reaping, not as a transactional guarantee, but as a spiritual law of the heart. Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. The passage promised that God was able to bless them abundantly, so that in all things at all times, having all that they needed, they would abound in every good work. David's initial reaction was one of practical resistance. How could he possibly give when he was on the verge of having nothing? It felt irresponsible, like pouring out his last canteen of water in the desert. But the text was clear. This was not about the amount, but about the posture of the heart. It was about trusting God with the very resource that felt most scarce, thereby declaring that his true security was not in his bank account, but in his provider. The conviction settled upon him not as a burdensome law, but as a liberating key. His financial fear was a prison, and the act of giving, however small, was a defiant act of picking the lock. He decided to start tithing, to give the first 10% of any income he received back to his church. The first time he did it, writing a check from the modest payment of the small project that had come his way, his hand trembled. It felt like throwing a precious seed into barren ground. But as the envelope slid into the offering plate the following Sunday, a remarkable thing happened. Instead of a sense of loss, he felt a sudden, unexpected lightness, a surge of joy that was completely disproportionate to the amount. It was the joy of participation, of aligning his actions with his professed trust. He was no longer a passive victim of his circumstances. He was an active partner in an economy of grace. Emboldened, he looked for another opportunity. He remembered the desperate email from the harbor, the nonprofit whose own funding had been cut. Though his formal contract with them was paused, He knew their need was greater than his own. He sat down and wrote a second check, a gift not from his surplus but from his need, and mailed it to Eleanor with a simple note of encouragement, telling her he was praying for them. The act felt reckless and right all at once. That evening, as he reviewed his budget, the numbers were just as grim as before. Yet the cold knot of anxiety in his stomach had loosened. In its place was a warm, steady glow. He had given cheerfully, and in the giving he had received something money could not buy. A profound sense that he was richer in trust than he was poor in funds. The blessings were not yet financial, but they were tangible. A deeper peace, a solidified marriage as Sarah supported his decision, and the inexplicable joy of knowing that even in his lack, he had something of value to offer. He was learning that generosity was not the result of financial abundance, but the pathway to a spiritual wealth that no market crash could ever threaten. The subtle fragrance of Sarah's morning coffee wove through the house, a familiar thread in the tapestry of their life, but David noticed a new pattern emerging in the weave. For weeks, he had been the one changing, his internal shifts like tremors, felt only by him. But transformation, once it takes root, cannot be hidden forever. It seeps into the atmosphere of a home, altering its very climate. Sarah was the first to sense the change in the air. She noticed it in the quiet mornings, in the way David no longer sat at the kitchen island with his shoulders hunched over his phone, his brow furrowed in a permanent state of siege. Now he would look up when she entered, his eyes meeting hers with a softness that had long been absent, a calm acknowledgment that felt like a homecoming. She saw it in the evenings, in the patience that had replaced his exasperated sighs over spilled milk or unfinished homework, his presence a steady anchor in the small chaotic storms of family life. One evening, as they cleared the dinner dishes in a comfortable silence, she finally gave voice to her observation. Her hand rested on his arm, stopping his movement. "You're different," she said, her voice soft but sure. "It's not just the job or the Bible study, it's you. You're peaceful." David looked at her, seeing the gentle curiosity in her eyes, the hope that had been so often bruised by his former distance. He didn't offer a theological explanation. Instead, he simply nodded and asked, "Would you pray with me?" The question hung in the air, a fragile bridge extended across a chasm that had existed for years. Their prayers before had been rote, perfunctory words spoken over meals. But this was an invitation to something more, a shared vulnerability. After a moment's hesitation, a flicker of her own nascent faith answering his, she took his hand. They began that night, standing in their kitchen surrounded by the mundane evidence of their shared life. Their first prayers were halting, simple expressions of gratitude for the food, for the children sleeping upstairs, for the strength to get through the day. But as the nights turned into a week, and then two, the prayers deepened. They began to share their fears, his for the business, hers for her aging parents. They confessed small failures and asked for patience with each other and their children. The simple act of standing together, hands clasped, voices quiet in the dim light, became a sacred recalibration of their marriage. The walls of self-sufficiency and unspoken resentment began to crumble, replaced by a foundation of shared dependence on a grace greater than themselves. The change did not go unnoticed by their children. Liam and Emma, attuned to the emotional weather of their home, sensed the shift from a climate of tense anxiety to one of gentle stability. They began to linger at the dinner table, their conversations less rushed, their laughter more frequent. One evening, as David and Sarah finished their prayer, a small voice piped up from the doorway. "What are you doing?" Emma asked, her small face curious in the half-light. Instead of shooing her back to bed, David knelt down and opened his arms. She ran into them, and he explained in simple terms that they were just talking to God, thanking Him for their family and asking Him to help them be kind. "Can I talk too?" she whispered. And so the circle widened. Liam, initially too cool for such displays, soon found himself drawn in by the simple, honest peace of the ritual. The family's evening prayer became a touchstone, a quiet space where victories were celebrated, worries were released, and forgiveness was sought and granted. The dynamics of the entire household began to shift on a fundamental level. Arguments that would have once spiraled into cold silences were now often diffused with a deep breath and a whispered prayer for patience. David found himself listening more and lecturing less, his heart softened by the daily practice of seeking grace. Sarah, feeling seen and supported in a new way, blossomed with a confidence that radiated through her parenting and her partnership. The children, secure in this new loving stability, became more cooperative and less prone to tantrums, their own small spirits responding to the atmosphere of peace. It was not a perfect, conflict-free existence, but a healthier, more resilient one. The relational healing was a quiet miracle, unfolding not in a dramatic instant, but in the cumulative power of shared moments, of clasped hands in the kitchen, of a child's simple prayer for a lost toy, of a marriage being gently, patiently restored, one whispered, "Amen," at a time. The greatest test of a transformed life is not in the quiet victories of personal growth, but in the willingness to pass the torch, to become a guide for another soul stumbling through their own wilderness. For David, this call arrived in the unassuming form of a young man named Leo, whom the pastor had quietly pointed out one Sunday. Leo was 24, his posture a fortress of defensive angles, his eyes holding the same hollow confusion David recognized from his own reflection in the dark computer screen months before. He was adrift, recently graduated into a bleak job market, his ambitions already tarnished by rejection, his faith a flickering candle in the wind of his disappointments. When the pastor asked if David might be willing to meet with him to share some of the wisdom he had gleaned, David felt not the pride of an expert, but the humble weight of a steward. He was being handed a fragile sapling, and he was being asked to show it how to find the Son. Their first meeting was in a quiet corner of the church's coffee hour, the air thick with the scent of brewing coffee and murmured fellowship. Leo's handshake was brief, his gaze fixed somewhere over David's shoulder. He spoke in clipped sentences about his useless degree, the companies that never called back, the overwhelming sense that his life had already veered off course before it had even begun. David listened, not with the ear of a problem solver, but with the heart of a fellow traveler. He heard the echoes of his own despair, the same questions of purpose and worth. When Leo finished, his shoulders slumped in defeat, David did not offer platitudes or quick fixes. He simply nodded and said, "I've been there. Let me tell you about a book of Proverbs and a letter from a man named James." He began not with a sermon, but with a story. He told Leo about the day he had sat in his own office, the severance letter feeling like a death certificate for his identity. He described the frantic, fruitless search for another corporate ladder to climb, the fear that was a constant, cold companion. And then he spoke of the worn Bible and how the practical, earthy wisdom of Proverbs had become his compass in the fog. He shared the verse that had become his anchor: "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding," and explained how that single command had forced him to stop relying on his own flawed, limited plans, and to trust in a guidance system that saw beyond the next quarterly report. He illustrated it with the story of his decision to start his consulting business, a choice that had seemed like financial suicide to his logical mind, but which had felt like the only right step in obedience to that higher wisdom. Then, seeing the flicker of curiosity in Leo's eyes, he turned to the book of James. He called it the New Testament's book of practical faith. He read the passage about considering it pure joy when facing trials, and he saw Leo's brow furrow in skepticism, just as his own had. So he told him about his own trials, the lost contracts, the financial freefall that had tested his faith to its breaking point. He confessed his own doubt, the terrifying feeling that God had gone silent. But he explained how James's teaching had reframed the struggle. The trials were not a sign of abandonment. They were the gymnasium where the muscle of perseverance was built. He shared how, in the midst of that storm, his faith had been stripped down from a feeling to a choice, a deliberate decision to trust the character of God even when his actions were incomprehensible. He used his own recent experience as a living case study, showing how the perseverance born from that crisis had given him a resilience he now carried into every new challenge. He watched as Leo's defensive posture slowly softened, the young man's gaze finally meeting his, no longer looking past him, but into the story he was telling. David was not just reciting verses, he was connecting ancient truth to the raw contemporary pain sitting across from him. He was showing Leo that the power of this wisdom was not in its eloquence, but in its application, that the same words that had guided an ancient king could guide a modern unemployed graduate. He was passing on the faith, not as a set of doctrines to be believed, but as a living, breathing source of guidance for the most practical and painful decisions of life. And in the act of mentoring, in the sharing of his own scars and the wisdom that had healed them, David found his own faith strengthened, its roots digging deeper as he helped another man plant his own. The words had been simmering in his spirit for days, a quiet but insistent echo from the final chapter of Matthew. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations. For months, David's faith had been a deeply personal renovation, a private conversation between his soul and his God. He had shared his story in the safety of his Bible study, mentored one young man in the quiet corners of the church, and found joy in serving the anonymous faces at the shelter. But this command felt different. It was a call to turn his personal testimony into a public invitation, to cast the net of his experience wider than the familiar waters of his immediate community. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying, a divine nudge that pushed him firmly out of his comfort zone and into the uncharted territory of intentional evangelism. He sat in his home office, the morning light spilling across the open page of Matthew 28. The directive was clear, but the method was not. How did a former accountant, a man more comfortable with spreadsheets than sermons, go and make disciples in his own suburban neighborhood? The thought of standing on a street corner or knocking on doors filled him with a cold dread. That felt performative, confrontational. But as he prayed, a different vision began to form. Not a proclamation, but a conversation. Not a sermon, but a sharing. He thought of the transformative power of the specific teachings that had reshaped his own life. The peace of the Beatitudes, the freedom of forgiveness from Matthew 18, the radical definition of love from 1 Corinthians 13. What if he created a space where those life-changing truths could be discussed openly without pressure among friends and neighbors who were perhaps as hungry for meaning as he had been? The plan began to crystallize with a practical clarity that felt guided. He would host a casual community event at his home, an evening he tentatively titled Ancient Wisdom for Modern Life. It would be an open house with simple refreshments and a warm, welcoming atmosphere. The centerpiece would be a short, heartfelt talk where he would share his own story of emptiness and discovery, focusing on 3 or 4 key Bible passages that had been pivotal in his journey. He would present them not as religious dictates, but as practical, transformative principles for dealing with anxiety, mending relationships, and finding purpose. The goal was not to convert, but to introduce, to plant a seed of curiosity, to show that the Bible was not a dusty relic, but a living source of relevant, powerful truth. The next step was the most daunting: the invitations. He drafted a simple, gracious email avoiding religious jargon. He sent it to a curated list. Neighbors he waved to but never truly knew. Old colleagues from his corporate days who had seen his struggle. Friends from his children's school who had commented on the new peace in his family. With each click of the send button, A fresh wave of vulnerability washed over him. He was exposing the most precious part of his life to potential rejection, to the same kind of mockery he had faced at his reunion. What if no one came? What if they laughed? What if they saw his faith as a peculiar hobby, an eccentricity to be politely endured? But beneath the fear was a steady, growing conviction. This was not his event. It was an act of obedience to a commission that felt both ancient and urgently personal. He was not responsible for the outcome, only for his faithful response. He spent the following days in preparation, not just arranging chairs and planning a menu, but on his knees, praying for each person on his list. He prayed for open hearts, for divine appointments, for the right words to convey not just information, but the hope he had found. He cleaned his house, not for show, but as an act of worship, creating a physical space that reflected the spiritual welcome he hoped to extend. The familiar anxiety of his old life was gone, replaced by a nervous anticipation, a sense that he was partnering in something far greater than himself. He was preparing not for a party, but for a harvest, trusting that the one who had issued the Great Commission would also provide the increase. The hum of quiet conversation and the warm, inviting scent of freshly brewed coffee filled David's living room, transforming the familiar space into a vessel of quiet anticipation. The chairs he had arranged in a loose semicircle were no longer just furniture. They were potential altars. As he watched, neighbors, former colleagues, and a few curious faces from his children's school find their seats, his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was the precipice. The carefully constructed walls of his private faith were about to be dismantled before an audience, his soul laid bare in the soft glow of the lamplight. He clutched the worn leather of his grandmother's Bible, its solid weight a tangible connection to the legacy of faith that had brought him to this moment. The fear was a live wire, but beneath its crackle flowed a deeper, steadier current of conviction. This was not a performance, it was an offering. He stepped into the space before the chairs, the gentle rustle of settling stilling as all eyes turned to him. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the air tasting of shared vulnerability. He began not with a theological argument, but with a memory, the stark, sterile whiteness of the severance envelope, the feeling of his identity shattering upon impact with a single piece of paper. He described the hollow man who had stared out at a city skyline that no longer held any promise, the crushing weight of a future that had dissolved into fog. His voice was quiet, earnest, painting a portrait of a despair so complete his listeners could feel it chill. He saw nods of recognition, the subtle shift in posture that signaled shared understanding. They knew this man. They had felt versions of that void. Then he held up the Bible. He described it not as a book of rules, but as a map he had found in his own attic, a guide to a country he never knew existed. He turned to Matthew 5, to the Beatitudes, and read the words that had been the first crack of light in his darkness. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." He explained how this single paradoxical idea that his brokenness was not a disqualification but an invitation had begun the thaw in his frozen soul. He saw a woman in the front row, a neighbor he knew was navigating a painful divorce, wipe a tear from her cheek, the words landing not as ancient poetry, but as a personal promise. He moved then to the heart of his talk, to the Sermon on the Mount. He spoke of the radical, impossible command to love one's enemies. And he told them about the phone call to Paul, the rejection, and the miraculous, unexpected freedom that had followed the obedience. He described it as the unshackling of a burden he had carried for so long he had mistaken it for a part of himself. A few faces registered surprise, the practicality of the application cutting through any preconceived notions of faith as a purely ethereal concept. Finally, he turned to 1 Corinthians 13. He called it the love chapter, but he presented it as a mirror. He confessed how, upon reading it, he had seen the stark reflection of a man who had been patient only when convenient, kind only when appreciated, a man who had kept a meticulous record of his wife's wrongs. He shared his commitment to redefining love as a verb, as a series of deliberate, self-sacrificing actions, starting with washing the dishes as an act of worship. The room was utterly still, the raw honesty of his self-appraisal creating a space of profound safety. He was not preaching down to them. He was standing beside them, showing them his own scars and the balm that had healed them. When he finished, the silence was deep and resonant, not empty, but full. Then the first hand went up. A man named Greg, a former colleague from his corporate days, asked a hesitant question about dealing with career-related anxiety. Another, a young mother named Chloe, wondered aloud how to begin practicing that kind of patience with her toddlers. The conversation that unfolded was not a debate, but a shared exploration. People were engaging not with a doctrine, but with a life. They saw the transformation in David not as a theory, but as a living, breathing reality. As the evening drew to a close and people began to linger over final cups of coffee, several approached him individually. Their voices were soft, their questions earnest. One couple asked if he knew of any beginner-friendly Bible studies. Another man, his eyes holding a deep weariness, simply said, "I need what you found. How do I start?" David stood amidst the lingering warmth of the gathering, his earlier fear a distant memory. The event was over, but the work had just begun. He had hosted a talk, but he had witnessed something far greater, the spark of curiosity igniting in other hearts, the first tentative steps of others toward the path that had saved him. He had answered the call to public witness, and in the quiet, engaged faces of his neighbors, he saw the first fruits of his obedience, not in dramatic conversions, but in the simple, powerful expression of interest, the shared longing for a peace that surpassed all understanding. The final guest had departed, the last coffee cup washed and put away, leaving David alone in the quiet aftermath of the evening. The hum of conversation had faded, but a new energy seemed to vibrate in the air of his living room, a lingering resonance of shared stories and awakened curiosity. The success of the event was not measured in numbers, but in the hesitant, hopeful questions that had been asked, the unguarded moments of connection that had transcended polite small talk. A week later, as he sat in his usual chair for his morning prayer, his thoughts were not on his own journey, but on the ripples it had created. He found himself praying for Greg, for Chloe, for the weary-eyed man, asking that the seeds planted that night would find fertile soil. The ripples began to return to him, not in dramatic waves, but in gentle, persistent eddies. The first came in an email from Greg, his former colleague. The subject line was simple: "Thank you." Greg wrote that he hadn't been able to stop thinking about David's story, particularly the part about forgiveness from Matthew 18. He confessed that he had been locked in a bitter, years-long feud with his own brother over a failed business partnership. The resentment had been a constant low-grade poison in his life, affecting his mood, his marriage, even his health. After the event, he had dug out an old Bible and read the parable of the unforgiving servant. The image of the servant, forgiven an unimaginable debt, yet refusing to forgive a paltry one, had struck him with the same force it had David. In a moment of raw conviction, he had picked up the phone. The conversation had been difficult, filled with old accusations and fresh pain, but they had talked, really talked. For the first time in a decade, they had listened. The relationship was not magically healed, Greg wrote, but the door was now open. The prison of his bitterness, which he had believed was a fortress protecting his pride, had been unlocked from the inside. He ended his email with a sentence that brought tears to David's eyes. "You showed me that forgiveness isn't about the other person deserving it. It's about you deserving peace." A few days later, a text message arrived from Chloe, the young mother. It was a picture of a chalkboard in her kitchen on which she had carefully written out the attributes of love from 1 Corinthians 13. Beneath it, she had written, "My new daily checklist." She explained that after hearing David talk about redefining love as a verb, she had decided to apply it to her most challenging relationship, her mother-in-law. Their interactions had always been strained, a minefield of subtle criticisms and defensive reactions. Inspired by David's story of washing dishes as an act of love, Chloe had decided to perform one small, kind act for her mother-in-law each day, without expectation of thanks or reciprocation. One day, it was mailing her a book she thought she'd enjoy. Another, it was watching her dog so she could go to an appointment. She wrote that the change was not in her mother-in-law, but in herself. The deliberate acts of patience and kindness were rewiring her own heart, draining the tension from their interactions and replacing it with a genuine, growing affection. "I'm learning that love isn't a feeling you wait for," she texted. "It's a choice you make, and the feeling follows." David read these messages, these testaments, from the front lines of other people's lives, and a profound sense of awe settled over him. He was merely a single stone dropped into the pond, but the ripples were traveling far beyond the point of impact. His own struggles with forgiveness and love, his own hard-won victories, were now becoming tools of grace in the hands of others. The teachings of Scripture were not static words on a page. They were living, breathing forces that, when applied, released a transformative power that could heal decades-old wounds and rebuild fractured relationships. The thematic thread of his entire journey, the ripple effect of a lived faith, was now being woven into the narratives of those around him. His story was no longer just his own. It had become a catalyst, a spark igniting other flames, each one casting its own light into the surrounding darkness, proving that a single obedient heart could indeed set in motion a current of hope that would touch shores he would never see. The leather-bound journal lay open on David's desk, its pages a testament to the seismic shifts that had reshaped the landscape of his soul. The pen felt familiar and weighty in his hand, a tool that had once recorded only figures and forecasts, now tasked with capturing the unquantifiable, the quiet revolution of a human heart. He turned back to the first entry, the shaky script of a man drowning in despair, and began to trace the arc of his journey, noting how each biblical teaching had been a chisel, carefully and sometimes painfully carving away the stone of his old self to reveal the man emerging beneath. The Beatitudes from Matthew 5 had been the foundation, the paradoxical truth that his poverty of spirit was the very key to the kingdom. That single insight had redefined his understanding of faith itself. It was not a system of merit or a set of beliefs to be affirmed, but a posture of humble dependence. Faith began not with strength, but with the admission of weakness. He saw how this had dismantled the altar of his own competence, where he had sacrificed his peace for the illusion of control. The subsequent teachings of the Sermon on the Mount had been the practical blueprints for this new life, challenging him to love the unlovable and forgive the unforgivable, actions that had felt impossible until he attempted them and discovered the freedom they unlocked. His gaze drifted to the entries on Galatians 5, the fruits of the Spirit. He saw the pattern of growth, slow and often imperceptible, like the turning of a season. The patience he had painstakingly cultivated with his daughter's tantrums had not remained confined to the kitchen. It had seeped into his business dealings, his conversations with Sarah, his response to slow traffic. It was a fruit that, once tasted, created a hunger for more, for a deeper kindness, a more resilient joy, a gentler spirit. He noted the areas that still felt barren, the fruit not yet fully ripe. Self-control, especially over his wandering thoughts of anxiety, and his quickness to internalize criticism, remained a daily battle, a field requiring constant weeding and prayer. The most profound reshaping, he wrote, had been in his understanding of grace. Ephesians had taught him that it was not a one-time pardon, but the very atmosphere of his new existence. It was the unearned favor that had met him in his despair, sustained him through financial freefall, and now empowered him to forgive himself for decades of missed marks and misguided priorities. Grace was the thread that tied every lesson together. It was the reason he could risk obedience without fear of failure, because his worth was no longer tethered to his performance, but anchored in a love that had already declared him accepted. This grace had redefined his purpose. It was no longer about building a successful life, but about participating in a sacred story, about becoming a conduit of the same love that had rescued him. He closed the journal, the final entry complete. The reflection was not an endpoint, but a cairn, a stack of stones to mark how far he had come and to orient him for the path ahead. He saw clearly that the journey was one of continuous application, of taking the eternal truths of Scripture and working them into the gritty, beautiful, and often messy details of an ordinary life. The patterns of growth were there, evident in the restored peace of his home, the mended bridge with its brother, the newfound courage to share his story. And the areas for further application were just as clear. The need for deeper trust in the face of ongoing uncertainty, for a more generous spirit when the resources felt tight, for a faith that would not just endure the next storm, but learn to dance in the rain. The man in the journal's first pages was a stranger to him now, a ghost of a life lived on the surface. The man who now closed the book knew the depths, and he was ready to keep diving. The soft glow of the lamp cast a warm circle of light on the open pages of 4 different Bibles, their margins filled with underlinings, question marks, and the faint, penciled notes of lives being wrestled with and remade. David looked around the circle of his Bible study group, the familiar faces of Ben, Leo, Robert, and the others now etched into the story of his own faith. Tonight's discussion had begun with a simple, modern anxiety, the relentless 24/7 news cycle and the pervasive sense of powerlessness it bred. They had spoken of financial fears, of political divisions, of the quiet, gnawing worry for their children's future in an increasingly complex world. These were not theoretical issues. They were the very air they breathed, the background static of their daily lives. It was Robert who had gently guided the conversation from the problem to the source of solace. He had asked the group to turn to the 4th chapter of Hebrews, to the 12th verse. David's eyes found the passage, the words he had read before now landing with a fresh, startling power. For the word of God is alive and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates even to dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart. Alive and active. The phrase seemed to pulse on the page, challenging his own, sometimes subconscious, tendency to view the Bible as a historical document or a collection of moral advice. This was something entirely different. This was a living entity, a dynamic force with a will and a purpose of its own. Ben, the fellow accountant, was the first to break the contemplative silence. He spoke of his own struggle with the very anxiety they had just discussed, the sleepless nights spent running financial scenarios for his family through his mind. He shared how he had recently been reading the Psalms and how the raw, unfiltered cries of David, the king's own fears, his anguished questions, his desperate pleas for deliverance, had not felt like ancient poetry, but like a contemporary conversation. The words written millennia ago had reached across time and circumstance and touched the exact tender spot of his own modern fear, offering not a platitude, but a companionship in the dark. The word was alive because it spoke to the unchanging condition of the human heart, regardless of the era. Leo, the young man David was mentoring, nodded slowly, his earlier defensiveness replaced by a thoughtful intensity. He confessed that he had always seen the Bible as a book of rules, a rigid list of do's and don'ts that felt irrelevant to his struggles with purpose and identity. But as David had shown him, and as this verse confirmed, it was more like a surgeon's scalpel. He described the uncomfortable, piercing clarity he felt when reading the Sermon on the Mount, how it exposed his own selfish motivations and judgmental attitudes, the very thoughts and attitudes of the heart the verse mentioned. It wasn't a blunt instrument of condemnation, but a precise tool for healing, cutting away the infection of pride and resentment to make room for something new and healthy to grow. The word was active because it did not just sit on the page, it performed surgery on the soul. David listened, the truth settling into him with a deep, resonating certainty. He thought of his own journey, a case study in the living, active nature of Scripture. The Beatitudes had diagnosed his despair. The parable of the unforgiving servant had exposed his bitterness. The love chapter had held a mirror to the poverty of his marriage. The teachings on grace had healed his shame. In every case, the ancient text had not simply informed him, it had interacted with him, confronting, comforting, challenging, and changing him from the inside out. It was as relevant to his 21st century anxiety as it was to a first century fisherman's fears on the Sea of Galilee, because it addressed the core human needs for peace, purpose, and love. The Bible was not a relic to be studied behind glass. It was a living word, a voice that spoke directly into the chaos of the modern world, offering a wisdom that was as sharp, necessary, and transformative today as it had ever been. In the quiet fellowship of that room, surrounded by the evidence of its power in their own lives, the relevance of Scripture was not a topic for debate, but a lived and breathing reality. The worn leather of his journal was a familiar landscape under David's fingertips, its pages a chronicle of a soul's migration from a desert of despair to an oasis of grace. Yet, as he reviewed the entries, the first tentative steps of faith, the painful pruning of unforgiveness, the slow cultivation of patience, the storms weathered, and the peace discovered, a new and compelling conviction began to crystallize within him. His story was no longer just a personal diary. It was a map charted with the very teachings that had rerouted his entire existence. The thought arrived not as a whisper, but as a clear, resonant calling. This journey was not meant to be a private memoir, but a public guide. He would write a book. The idea felt both audacious and utterly natural. He was an accountant, not an author. He dealt in the concrete language of numbers, not the fluid poetry of narrative. But as he sat in the quiet of his office, the morning sun spilling across his desk, he realized that the most powerful language he had ever learned was the one of lived experience, of Scripture applied to the raw, unvarnished realities of a crumbling career, a strained marriage, and a searching heart. He opened a fresh document on his computer, the blank screen, a canvas of terrifying possibility. At the top, he typed a working title, From Ledgers to Life, a journey of faith rediscovered. It was a declaration, a framing of his entire ordeal, not as a failure, but as a necessary unraveling that had led to a truer weaving. He began to outline the chapters, his mind organizing the chaos of his experience into a coherent narrative arc. The structure emerged organically, each chapter built around a specific biblical teaching that had acted as a pivot point in his transformation. Chapter 1 would be the crisis of emptiness, setting the stage with the severance package and the shattered identity. Chapter 2, the unexpected gift, would introduce the discovery of the Bible and the first glimmer of hope in the Beatitudes. He mapped out the progression, the cost of forgiveness for Matthew 18, the verb of love for 1 Corinthians 13, the anchor of sovereignty for Romans 8. He saw how each scriptural truth had addressed a specific void in his life, the need for peace, the burden of bitterness, the poverty of love, the illusion of control. This was more than a literary exercise, it was an act of worship. He saw the book as a way to reach beyond the circle of his Bible study and the attendees of his community event. It was a way to extend the hand of hope to the man staring at a pink slip in a silent office, to the woman nursing a decades-old grudge, to anyone who felt that the ancient words of the Bible had no bearing on their modern anxiety. He was not writing to become an authority, but to become a witness. His authority would not be in his eloquence, but in his authenticity, in the scars he was willing to show and the healing he could attest to. This new vocation, emerging from the ashes of his old one, felt like the most logical and fulfilling culmination of his journey. He was no longer just David the consultant or David the Bible study member. He was becoming David the chronicler of grace, using the skills of his old life, organization, clarity, analysis, to articulate the wonders of his new one. The cursor blinked on the screen, a steady, patient metronome counting the beat of a new beginning, a purpose forged not in success, but in surrender, and now offered back as a gift. The cursor blinked on the blank screen, a tiny, relentless metronome counting the silence in David's office. The outline was complete, a skeletal structure of his pain and redemption, but now the task was to clothe those bones with the flesh of memory and the spirit of truth. He began to write, his fingers finding a hesitant rhythm on the keyboard. The first chapter poured out of him, a visceral reliving of the severance package's cold finality, the hollow man staring at a city skyline that had lost all its meaning. He wove in the words of the Beatitudes, not as a commentary, but as the very oxygen that had entered his suffocating world. He described the strange, inexplicable peace as a lifeline thrown into his inner chaos, the first divine thread pulled in the great unraveling and reweaving of his soul. The words flowed, each sentence a stepping stone back through the landscape of his despair, now viewed with the clarifying lens of grace. But then he reached the chapter on forgiveness. He had to describe the phone call to Paul, the sting of rejection. The screen seemed to freeze, the words clotting in his mind. He stared at the paragraph, the emotions too raw, the memory of his own pride and the subsequent freedom too complex to capture. A wall of mental static descended, a familiar foe